I'm the Midnight Storyteller, here to keep you company through the quiet hours. Many of you listen to these stories to fall asleep, and I'm honored to guide you there. And before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep the stories alive. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it on your side of the night? Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. The fluorescent lights in the office flickered. Evan glanced at his monitor, the clock in the corner reading 11:47 p.m. The floor was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the building's air conditioning. Everyone else had long since gone home, leaving him with nothing but lines of code and the pressure of an impossible deadline. Evan sighed and saved his work. The glowing letters on his screen blurred as fatigue dragged at him. Grabbing his bag, he muttered, "Enough for today," and headed to the elevator. The lobby on his floor stretched out before him, sterile and devoid of life. The tap of his shoes echoed unnaturally loud as he approached the elevator. When he pressed the down button, the faint ding of the elevator arriving made him feel a glimmer of relief. But as the doors opened and he stepped inside, he noticed something odd. There was no L button for the lobby, only a single, unmarked button at the bottom of the panel. A wave of confusion prickled the back of his neck. His floor, the lobby, the executive levels, they were all missing from the panel. He stared for a long moment before hesitantly pressing the unmarked button. The doors shut with an unsettlingly quiet swoosh, and the elevator lurched downward. But it didn't stop. The floor numbers above the door cycled down 2-1, B1, B2. Then it went blank. The hum of the elevator grew louder, a deep, resonant drone that vibrated through Evan's chest. He gripped the railing, his unease blooming into something sharper as the elevator slowed to a stop. The doors opened. Before him stretched a dim hallway lined with frosted glass office doors, the faint, sterile smell of industrial cleaner heavy in the air. Evan frowned. This floor didn't exist, at least not on the building's blueprints. He'd seen them a dozen times when helping set up the office's new server room. Yet here it was, with no signage or number to indicate its purpose. "Hello." His voice echoed softly down the hall, answered only by silence. Unease coiled in his stomach. He stepped out of the elevator, turning back just in time to see the doors snap shut behind him. The elevator's button panel blinked off. He pressed the call button. Nothing. A slow dread settled over him. His eyes scanned the endless stretch of identical office doors ahead. Frosted glass panes distorted the dark interiors of the rooms, casting faint, flickering shadows that didn't seem tied to any source. Something rustled behind one of the doors. He froze, his ears straining. Whispers, soft and indistinct, trickled through the hallway. They were faint, like a breeze carrying voices just out of reach. Evan, his breath hitched. The whisper was unmistakable. Someone had said his name. His voice cracked as he backed away from the door. The sound of his name came again, layered over itself, as though a dozen voices whispered in unison. Shadows moved behind the frosted glass, drifting closer to the door, and Evan's legs locked in place. Then came the knock. A sharp, deliberate knock reverberated from the office door in front of him, sending a jolt of terror through his chest. He stumbled backward, bumping into the wall. The door's handle jiggled, but it didn't open. Heart pounding, Evan turned and bolted down the hallway. Doors lined either side of him, each identical, each office filled with empty desks and dim lighting. But something was wrong. No matter how stretched on. Each turn he took brought him back to the same intersection, the same stretch of doors. The whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. More voices joined in, a chorus of soft murmurs echoing his name. Evan. At the end of the hallway, he spotted a flickering light spilling from one of the offices. Desperation drove him forward. He pushed through the door, slamming it shut behind him only to find himself staring at a familiar sight, his own cubicle. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. His desk, his monitor, his half-empty coffee mug from that morning, everything was there. He crept closer, his hand trembling as he reached for the desk. The coffee was still warm. "No, this isn't real," he whispered. The room felt too cold, the air too still. The monitor flickered to life, and a video began to play. It was of him. He watched himself sitting at the same desk, working late, his face drawn with exhaustion. The camera angle shifted, showing him slumped over the keyboard, his breath slowing until his chest stilled. Evan staggered back, bile rising in his throat. "No," he gasped, "I didn't, this isn't." The whispers grew louder, and the door behind him creaked open. Frosted glass distorted the figures standing just beyond the threshold. Faces pressed against the glass, faint and shadowed, their eyes locked onto him, their mouths moving in unison. "Stay," they whispered, "you belong here." Evan turned and ran. The hallway seemed to warp around him, growing narrower, the walls pressing closer. Every door he passed revealed more fragments of his life. Failures at work, fights with his family, nights spent alone as he chose work over everything else. The images grew more vivid, each office a mirror of his regrets. He skidded to a halt as the elevator loomed before him again, its doors open, glowing faintly. Relief flooded him, and he lunged inside, slamming the button for the lobby. The doors began to close, but just before they did, a hand shot through the gap. It was gray and cold, its fingers thin and unnaturally long. It pried the doors apart, and a face loomed out of the darkness. It was his face. The doppelganger smiled, its eyes empty and black as it whispered, "You're one of us now." The elevator plunged downward, faster and faster, the hum turning into a deafening roar. Evan screamed as the walls of the elevator warped, the floor dissolving beneath his feet. He fell into darkness, the whispers rising to a crescendo around him. Weeks later, the cleaning crew found Evan's cubicle exactly as he'd left it, his half-empty coffee mug still sitting beside his keyboard, his computer screen aglow with lines of unfinished code. On the 13th floor, listed nowhere on the building's plans, the lights flickered, and faint whispers echoed down the endless hallway. The end. The Victorian manor stood like a weary sentinel at the edge of the forest, its peeling paint and sagging beams a testament to years of neglect. The project was a dream for Ryan, a contractor known for taking old, forgotten spaces and making them beautiful again. The elderly owner, Mrs. Hargrove, had hired him to transform the house into a cozy bed and breakfast, a place where she could live out her final years surrounded by the warmth of visitors. "This house has its quirks," she said the first day, her wrinkled hands twisting nervously around her cane. "But some things are better left as they are." Ryan nodded, not fully listening. Old houses always had quirks, creaky floors, strange drafts, maybe a ghost story or two. That was part of their charm. He'd smiled and assured her he could handle whatever the house threw at him. He didn't know then that the house was listening. It was in the second week of renovations that Ryan discovered the door. He'd been clearing out the attic, a musty space filled with crumbling boxes and forgotten furniture. The air was heavy with the scent of rot, and the only light came from his flashlight beam slicing through the gloom. He was moving an old wardrobe when he noticed it. A small dark door, barely 3 feet high, nestled into the far wall. Its wood was blackened with age, and a rusted iron keyhole glared up at him like an unblinking eye. Odd, he muttered, crouching to inspect it. The door didn't appear on any of the blueprints he'd reviewed, and the wall it was set into shouldn't have had space behind it. He pressed his ear to the wood, listening, but heard nothing. When he mentioned it to Mrs. Hargrove, her face turned pale. "You didn't open it, did you?" she asked sharply. "No," Ryan said, taken aback. "It's locked." "Good," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't. That door isn't meant to be opened." Ryan frowned. "Why? What's behind it?" Mrs. Hargrove didn't answer. She only shook her head and shuffled away, muttering something under her breath. The door lingered in Ryan's mind. He told himself it was just curiosity, the kind of curiosity that came with his job. But the more he tried to forget about it, the more it pulled at him. Every night, he dreamed of it. The dark wood, the iron keyhole, the faint hum that seemed to come from behind it in his sleep. By the third day, he couldn't resist anymore. He returned to the attic with a crowbar. His flashlight cast long shadows across the slanted ceiling as he knelt before the door. "Just a look," he whispered to himself, his breath misting in the cold air. "I'll patch it up after." The wood groaned as he pried at the frame. With a final snap, the lock gave way and the door creaked open. Beyond it was a small windowless room, empty except for a single chair positioned in the center. Opposite the chair, leaning against the far wall, was a tall, oval mirror. The glass was cloudy, its edges chipped, but Ryan could see his reflection faintly, distorted by the uneven surface. A chill ran down his spine. The room was wrong, too cold, too quiet. The air pressed against him, heavy and oppressive. He backed away, the door swinging shut behind him. The first sign that something was off came the next day. As Ryan worked on the kitchen cabinets, he felt it, a prickling at the back of his neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He turned, expecting to see Mrs. Hargrove, but the room was empty. Later, while polishing a window, he caught his reflection staring back at him. Not just staring, watching. Its movements lagged behind his own, a split-second delay that sent his heart racing. He stepped back, blinking, and the reflection snapped back to normal. He laughed nervously, brushing it off his exhaustion. But the feeling didn't go away. By the end of the week, Ryan's movements grew sluggish. His arms felt heavy, his legs unsteady, as though invisible strings were pulling him in directions he didn't want to go. The house felt alive, its creaks and groans taking on a rhythm that seemed deliberate. Shadows in the corners stretched unnaturally, and every reflective surface, the mirrors, the windows, even the polished wood of the banister, seemed to hold faint echoes of his face, always watching, always waiting. He tried to avoid the attic, but the door haunted him. In his dreams, he saw the chair, the mirror, and his own reflection staring back at him, hollow-eyed and still. The whispers began soon after, faint and indistinct, calling his name in the dead of night. On the 7th day, he couldn't take it anymore. Ryan climbed the attic stairs, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The small door was still there, the black wood untouched despite his earlier attempts to force it open. He knelt before it, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He didn't want to open it again, but the pull was too strong. He pushed the door open. The room had changed. Instead of one chair, there were dozens, arranged in neat rows, all facing the mirror. The chairs were mismatched, some simple and wooden, others ornate with intricate carvings, but each one was occupied by a reflection. Ryan's heart pounded as he stepped inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across the mirror. The reflections were all different versions of himself. Older, younger, some pale and gaunt, others twisted and grotesque. They sat rigid in their chairs, their glassy eyes fixed on the mirror. In the reflection, he saw himself stepping into the room, but the Ryan in the mirror wasn't holding a flashlight. He was smiling. Panic surged as Ryan turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him. The mirror began to hum, a low vibration that rattled his teeth. The reflections stood in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Let me out," Ryan screamed, pounding on the door. His fists made no sound against the wood. When he turned back, the reflections were closer, their expressions blank, their eyes black voids. The Ryan in the mirror stepped forward, placing a hand against the glass. "It's your turn now," it whispered, its voice distorted and hollow. Ryan felt himself being pulled, his limbs no longer his own. He stumbled toward the chair at the center of the room, his body jerking like a marionette. He tried to fight, but the strings were too strong. His reflection sat down, and in the mirror, the door creaked open. When Mrs. Hargrove found the attic later that week, she sighed and closed the door without looking inside. She'd warned him. They never listened. The next contractor would come soon, lured by the promise of the old house's charm, and the mirror would be waiting. From within the room, Ryan sat among the others, his glassy eyes fixed on the mirror. His reflection stared back, alive and free, walking out of the house into the sunlight. The real Ryan screamed silently, but no sound escaped. He was just another reflection now, watching, waiting the end. The fire station in Green Hollow was a relic of another time. Its red brick facade and tall bell tower were holdovers from an era when horse-drawn carriages hauled water tanks. Though the town itself had grown quiet over the years, the station remained staffed by a handful of firefighters who saw more false alarms and stray cats than actual emergencies. Jake Larson, the rookie on the team, couldn't believe how laid back the job was. He'd come from the city, expecting adrenaline and action, but Green Hollow seemed frozen in time. The crew spent their days polishing the trucks, playing cards, and recounting old stories. But there was one story they never joked about: the midnight alarms. It was a week into Jake's first shift when he heard about it. "You'll hear it sooner or later," said Captain Mills, the gray-haired veteran who'd been with the station for decades. "The fifth alarm." Jake frowned. "What's the fifth alarm?" Mills exchanged a glance with the other firefighters. Finally, it was Garcia, a burly man with a deep voice, who answered. "Sometimes the alarm goes off at midnight," Garcia said, "but it's not real. You don't answer it." Jake chuckled nervously. "You're messing with me." "No one's messing with you," Mills said, his voice firm. "You don't answer it. Do your checks, sit tight, and let it ring. That's an order." The tension in the room was palpable, the usual camaraderie replaced with unease. The first time Jake heard the midnight alarm, it sent a chill down his spine. The firehouse was silent, the crew fast asleep in the bunks when the klaxon shattered the stillness. Its wail was deafening, reverberating through the station as the emergency lights flashed red. Jake bolted upright, adrenaline kicking in. He reached for his gear, but stopped when he noticed no one else was moving. Captain Mills sat up slowly in his bunk, his face grim. "Go back to sleep, rookie," he said. "But the alarm—" "It's not for us," Mills interrupted. Confused and frustrated, Jake hesitated before reluctantly lying back down. The alarm continued for a few minutes, then fell silent. The second time the alarm went off, Jake couldn't ignore it. He'd been restless, sitting alone in the kitchen, when the wail started again. It was louder this time, more urgent, like a cry for help. Jake stood, staring at the glowing red beacon on the wall. His heart pounded as he remembered Garcia's warning, but his instincts as a firefighter screamed at him to act. "Why do we ignore it?" he asked aloud, though no one was there to answer. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. What if it's real? By the third midnight alarm, curiosity won. Jake suited up quietly, careful not to wake the others, and slipped into the driver's seat of the engine. The alarm's coordinates flashed on the screen, leading to a house at the edge of town. The drive through the empty streets was eerie. The snow-covered roads reflected the flashing lights of the engine, and the wail of the siren echoed into the void. When Jake arrived, his breath caught. The house was engulfed in flames, the inferno roaring against the midnight sky. Dark smoke billowed upward, blotting out the stars. But what struck him most was the silence. No neighbors, no sounds of panic, just the relentless crackle of fire. Jake grabbed his gear and ran toward the house. As he approached, he heard screams, high-pitched and desperate. Figures moved frantically behind the glowing windows, their silhouettes distorted by the flames. "I'm coming," Jake shouted, his voice cracking. He smashed through the front door, heat slamming into him like a wave. The air inside was thick and suffocating, but he pushed forward, scanning for survivors. In the living room he saw them, shadowy figures huddled together, their faces obscured. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were marionettes on invisible strings. "Let's get out of here," Jake yelled, reaching for the closest figure. Its head snapped toward him. The face wasn't human. Jake stumbled backward, his stomach lurching. The figure's hollow eyes and gaping mouth emitted a soundless scream, and its skin was charred, its edges flickering like burnt paper. The other figures turned toward him as well, their distorted faces stretching into grotesque masks of agony. Jake ran. The house seemed to shift around him, the hallways elongating as the flames licked closer. The screaming figures followed, their steps eerily synchronized. When he burst through the front door, the house collapsed behind him in a shower of sparks. He sprinted to the engine and threw it into reverse, his hands shaking. Back at the station, Jake burst through the doors, drenched in sweat and reeking of smoke. "What the hell were you thinking?" Mills growled, already waiting for him. Jake froze. "You knew." Mills's face was pale, his eyes hollow. "We warned you." Jake's voice rose. "There was a fire. I saw people in there, if you can even call them that. What's happening here?" Mills sighed heavily. "The fifth alarm is from the past," he said. "That fire happened over 30 years ago. A whole family died because we didn't get there in time. Some say it was our fault. The chief back then ignored the first call, thought it was a prank." Garcia added grimly, "The alarm started coming back after the station was rebuilt. It's a reminder. Or maybe a punishment." Jake sat down hard, his mind racing. "You're telling me this happens to all of you?" "No," Mills said, "just to the ones who answer it." Jake's stomach sank. What does that mean? You saw them, didn't you? Mills asked quietly. Jake nodded, his throat dry. You've been marked. The next few days were a blur. Jake tried to focus on work, but the station felt colder, the shadows longer. He avoided mirrors, certain he'd see something behind him. The alarm didn't go off again until the following week. This time it rang at exactly midnight, louder than ever. Jake's hands trembled as he sat in his bunk, trying to ignore it. But when he looked at the others, they were already awake, staring at him with pity. It's for you now, Mills said softly. Jake didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The alarm's pull was too strong, its wail cutting through his resolve like a knife. He stood, walking toward the engine as if in a trance. Mills called after him. You don't have to go. But Jake knew it was too late. The next morning, Jake's bunk was empty, his gear missing. The other firefighters didn't speak of him, just as they hadn't spoken of the others who had answered the fifth alarm before him. The station remained silent, waiting for the next midnight call. The end. The estate stood silent and foreboding on the fog-choked moor, its crumbling facade barely visible through the shifting gray mist. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, an archaeologist with a reputation for chasing myths, clutched the ornate key she had unearthed. Its intricate, curling pattern seemed almost alive under her fingertips, as though it pulsed faintly with the beat of her own heart. You shouldn't go back there, warned the innkeeper as she prepared to leave that morning. No one who unlocks that door comes back the same. Eleanor had laughed off the warning. Superstition was a language she didn't speak. The key was real, its craftsmanship centuries old, and it matched the strange lock she had found hidden behind a bookcase in the library of the long-abandoned Blackthorn estate. It was a discovery she couldn't ignore. Now, standing before the estate's towering doors, Eleanor hesitated. The wind howled through the gaps in the stonework, carrying faint whispers she told herself were tricks of the wind. She squared her shoulders, the key tight in her grasp, and pushed the heavy door open. Inside the estate was a graveyard of dust and silence. Her footsteps echoed faintly as she made her way to the library, its air heavy with the scent of mildew and forgotten books. The hidden lock waited just where she'd found it, embedded in the wall beneath a faded oil painting of a dark-haired woman, whose eyes seemed to follow Eleanor's every move. She slid the key into the lock, the metal fitting with an almost unnatural ease. A deep click echoed through the room as the hidden door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the darkness. Eleanor hesitated. Every rational part of her mind urged her to turn back. But the thrill of discovery burned brighter. She flicked on her flashlight and descended, each step creaking under her weight. The staircase ended in a circular chamber. The walls were lined with shelves of crumbling books and jars filled with indiscernible, cloudy liquids. But what drew Eleanor's attention was the massive object in the center of the room. A tall mirror, its surface hidden beneath a black velvet covering. The mirror's size was unnatural, easily twice her height and framed with ornate carvings that writhed like shadows in the flickering beam of her flashlight. She reached out and hesitated, her hand inches from the fabric. "It's just a mirror," she whispered, as if to convince herself. With one swift motion, she pulled the velvet free, The surface gleamed like polished obsidian, reflecting her face perfectly. But as she stared, something about her reflection unsettled her. It seemed wrong. The edges of the mirror shimmered, and Eleanor realized her reflection wasn't quite matching her movements. She tilted her head. The image tilted a fraction slower. She stepped back, but her reflection lingered for an impossible moment before following. "Ridiculous," she muttered, though her voice cracked slightly. She turned to leave but froze. The room had changed. The staircase was gone, replaced by smooth stone walls. The shelves now stood empty, the jars shattered. The air felt heavier, colder. The beam of her flashlight wavered as she turned back toward the mirror. Her reflection was still there, but it wasn't her anymore. The figure in the glass was twisted, its face an exaggeration of her own. The cheekbones were sharper, the eyes hollow, and the grin stretched impossibly wide. It raised a hand and waved, though Eleanor hadn't moved. Panic clawed at her chest. She stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the ground. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It's not real." The mirror rippled, the surface distorting like water, and images began to appear. At first she saw memories, moments from her life replayed in haunting detail. Her first expedition, the triumph on her face as she unearthed an ancient relic. Then the darker memories, the argument with her mentor that had cost her her reputation, the funeral she hadn't attended because she'd been chasing a discovery halfway across the world. The images shifted faster and faster, blurring together until they became a chaotic montage of her failures and regrets. "No," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Stop." The mirror obeyed, but what it showed next froze her blood. It was the future, or what seemed to be. She saw herself wandering the estate, her eyes vacant and hollow. Then she was on the moor, standing in the fog, as shadowy figures surrounded her, their forms whispering and writhing like smoke. She saw herself in the chamber, screaming soundlessly as the mirror swallowed her whole. She backed away, her chest heaving. The distorted version of herself in the mirror grinned wider, stepping closer to the surface. Its hand pressed against the glass, the dark liquid-like surface rippling outward. The room dimmed as the shadows deepened, coiling around Eleanor like living things. She tried to scream, but her voice was stolen by the suffocating silence. The figure in the mirror leaned closer until its face filled the glass. Its hollow eyes met hers, and it whispered in her voice, "You opened the door. Now I'm free." The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and Eleanor was plunged into darkness. When she woke, she was standing on the moor, the estate looming behind her. The fog had thinned, and the faint glow of dawn painted the horizon. She blinked, disoriented, her heart racing as she tried to piece together what had happened. Her hands felt strange. She raised them to her face and froze. Her fingers were no longer hers, they were pale and sharp. The skin stretched unnaturally tight over the bone. She stumbled toward a shallow puddle nearby, the water reflecting the faint light. Her face was no longer her own. It was the face of the reflection, the twisted grin, the hollow eyes. She let out a strangled scream that echoed unnaturally across the moor, and then she heard it. Her voice, faint and distant, calling from the direction of the estate. "Help me," it cried. "Please." She turned toward the sound, but deep down she knew. The real Eleanor was still in the chamber, trapped on the other side of the mirror, and now she was just a shadow, wandering the moors, waiting for the next soul to find the key. The end. of fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Zoe settled into the librarian's desk for another overnight shift. The library's archive system cast a faint glow from the screen in front of her, its rows of folders a quiet reminder of the endless hours ahead. She'd taken the job for solitude, a break from the chaos of the outside world. Most nights the hours passed in predictable silence, interrupted only by the occasional shuffle of a patron too deep in their studies to notice the time. But tonight felt different. The library was empty, the air heavy with a strange stillness. Even the ever-present sounds of the city outside seemed muted. Zoe shook the unease from her mind and logged into the digital archive system, intent on making a dent in the backlog of file reorganization. She clicked through folders, each one more mundane than the last. Historical maps, rare book index, local newspapers. It was routine, almost mind-numbing, until she saw the folder. It was buried deep in the system, tucked beneath layers of subfolders. Midnight Patrons, it read. The name stood out, odd and out of place. Zoe hesitated before clicking it open. Inside was a list of names, each accompanied by a photograph and a timestamp. At first she thought it was some kind of old attendance log, but as she scrolled, her unease deepened. The timestamps didn't make sense. They were all set in the future. Tomorrow, next week, next month, and the descriptions next to each name chilled her to the bone. Helen Grayson, 3:12 a.m., victim of hit and run, Elm Street. Liam Ortega, 8:47 p.m., reported missing, presumed dead. Martha Flynn, 2:30 p.m., apartment fire, unable to escape. The photos attached to each name showed faces frozen in unsuspecting moments, smiling, laughing, going about their lives, blissfully unaware of the grim fates detailed beside their names. Zoe leaned back in her chair, her pulse racing. "What the hell is this?" she whispered to herself. The following morning, Zoe couldn't shake the folder from her mind. She told herself it was some kind of morbid prank, an elaborate joke left behind by a bored archivist. But as she scrolled through her phone during lunch, a headline stopped her cold. Hit-and-run victim identified as Helen Grayson. The timestamp in the article matched exactly. Her stomach churned. It couldn't be a coincidence. She returned to the library that night, her hands trembling as she logged back into the archive system. The Midnight Patrons folder was still there, but now the list had grown. More names, more faces, more detailed descriptions of tragedies yet to occur. Zoe clicked through the entries, dread pooling in her chest. She recognized some of the faces now, local patrons who frequented the library, a man who always checked out history books, a young woman who loved Victorian literature. Their names were followed by grim fates, all time stamped for the near future. She had to do something. Zoe spent hours trying to delete the folder, but the system wouldn't allow it. Every time she clicked delete, the screen flickered, and the folder reappeared as if mocking her. She tried erasing the entries individually, but they returned as quickly as she removed them. "Come on," she muttered, her voice shaking. She unplugged the computer, her breath catching in her throat. But when she turned it back on, the folder was still there, bigger now, with even more names. At the bottom of the list, her own name appeared. Zoe Marshall, 2:17 a.m., cause of death, TBD. The photo next to her name was fresh. It showed her sitting at the desk, staring at the screen with wide eyes, exactly as she was now. The clock on the wall read 1:49 a.m. Panic set in as Zoe scrambled to make sense of what was happening. She checked the library's security cameras, but the feeds were distorted, glitching in and out. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights was gone, replaced by a faint static that seemed to crawl into her ears. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, pooling in the corners of the room like ink. And then she heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing down the empty halls. Zoe froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The library was supposed to be locked. She'd checked the doors herself. "Hello," she called, her voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. The screen flickered, static filling her ears as the Midnight Patrons folder opened on its own, the screen glowing brighter than before. Her photo moved. The version of her in the image turned its head, staring straight at her, and smiled. The footsteps stopped. A shadow fell across the desk. Zoe turned slowly, her breath catching as she saw him. The figure was tall and gaunt, shrouded in darkness. His face was obscured by a black hood, but his presence was suffocating, filling the room with a cold, oppressive weight. "Who are you?" she choked out, backing away. The figure didn't answer. He moved closer, his steps unnervingly silent, despite the weight of his presence. Zoe stumbled, her legs trembling as she tried to put distance between them. But no matter how far she moved, he was always closer than before. The figure raised a hand, long and skeletal, and pointed to the screen. The folder expanded, her name glowing brighter than the rest. "It's not predicting them," Zoe whispered, the realization hitting her like a blow. "It's making them happen." The figure tilted his head, as though pleased. The clock on the wall struck 2:17 a.m. The last thing Zoe saw was the screen, her photo shifting as the timestamp disappeared. The cause of death filled itself in, the words clear and final. Zoe Marshall, 2:17 a.m., taken by the Midnight Archivist. The library was silent once more. When the morning crew arrived, they found the desk empty, Zoe's chair pushed neatly under the table. Her belongings were untouched, her laptop powered off. No one knew where she had gone. The Midnight Patrons folder remained, buried deep in the archive system, waiting for the next night. And when someone opened it, they would find a new name at the bottom of the list. Yours. The end. The sleek lines of the high-rise towered above the city, its reflective glass exterior gleaming in the sunlight. On the 30th floor, Adam Voss, a tech mogul known for his obsession with control and precision, had finally found the perfect home. The apartment was a marvel of modern design, minimalist furniture, walls lined with cutting-edge tech, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the skyline. But one detail didn't fit. In the corner of the sprawling apartment was a windowless, unmarked door. The door was made of reinforced steel, painted to match the walls, almost as if the designer had tried to hide it. When Adam first noticed it, he frowned. "What's behind this?" The realtor hesitated. "It's a storage room, I think. No one's opened it in years." Adam arched an eyebrow. "And the key?" The realtor shrugged. "Lost." It was the only imperfection in an otherwise flawless space. Adam didn't like imperfections. The first night in the apartment, Adam lay awake in his sleek, king-sized bed, the city lights casting faint patterns across the ceiling. It was quiet, eerily so, until he heard it, a faint scratching sound. At first he thought it was coming from the walls, but as he sat up, the sound grew more distinct, more deliberate. It was coming from the locked room. The next morning, Adam called building maintenance. 2 workers arrived, armed with tools and crowbars, but after hours of effort, the door remained firmly shut. "Something's off about this," one of the workers muttered. Adam crossed his arms, glaring at the sealed door. "I'll handle it." He had the money, after all. Within a week, Adam had installed cameras and motion sensors throughout the apartment, all linked to his state-of-the-art security system. If anything moved near that door, he'd know. But the second night, the scratching returned. Adam checked the live feed on his phone, his heart racing. But the camera aimed at the door showed nothing, no movement, no sound. The next morning, when he reviewed the footage, the recording cut out precisely at 3:12 a.m., just as the noises began. Adam didn't believe in ghosts, but his jaw tightened as unease settled in. Days passed, and the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It started earlier each night, until Adam could no longer ignore it. One night, as the sound echoed through the apartment, he approached the door, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you want?" he demanded. The scratching stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then slowly, a single shadow slid out from under the door, pulling at his feet. Adam stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the carpet. But when he flipped on the lights, the shadow was gone. Adam's sleep became fragmented, his dreams filled with suffocating darkness and whispers he couldn't quite understand. The shadows in his apartment grew darker, stretching unnaturally in the corners of the room. One morning, as he brushed his teeth, he noticed something strange in the mirror. The reflection of the locked door seemed wrong. The faint outline of a figure stood in its place, just behind him. When Adam whipped around, the space was empty. Desperation drove him to hire a locksmith, a wiry man with a toolbox and a cocky attitude. "Never met a lock I couldn't open," the man bragged as he set to work. But after an hour of drilling and prying, the locksmith stepped back, pale and sweating. "This door's not normal," he muttered. "It's like it doesn't want to be opened." Adam wrote him a check and sent him away, anger and fear simmering just below the surface. That night, the shadows spilled out from under the door again, creeping across the floor like ink spreading through water. Adam stood frozen, watching as they climbed the walls and snaked toward the windows. His smart lights flickered, plunging the apartment into brief bursts of darkness. In the shadows, he saw movement, glimpses of figures, thin and angular, their hollow eyes glinting. One of them whispered his name. Adam stopped leaving the apartment, consumed by the mystery of the room. He canceled meetings, ignored calls, and barricaded himself in his office. His once pristine apartment became cluttered with papers, tools, and blueprints as he tried to find answers. He combed through the building's records, but there was no mention of the locked room in the original blueprints. It was as if it had always been there, yet never existed. On the 5th night, the scratching didn't come. Instead, the door creaked open. Adam started, his breath caught in his throat. The room beyond was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seemed to absorb the light. A voice, low and resonant, echoed from within. "You've stayed too long." Against every instinct, Adam stepped closer. His curiosity overpowered his fear as he peered into the room. The shadows shifted, forming shapes, hands, faces reaching toward him. "You are the anchor," the voice said. "What does that mean?" Adam whispered, his voice trembling. "You let us in." The shadows lunged and Adam screamed. Days later, the building's concierge noticed that Adam hadn't been seen in some time. When the police arrived to check on him, they found the apartment pristine. The cameras, lights, and tools were gone, and there was no sign anyone had ever lived there, except for the locked door. It remained, its surface unmarked and its secrets intact, waiting for the next tenant. The end. The neon sign outside the deserter buzzed faintly, casting a flickering glow over the empty parking lot. Inside, Marcy leaned on the counter, her fingers tracing idle patterns in a puddle of spilled coffee. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that seeped into your bones and made you feel like the last person alive. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:59 p.m. Almost closing time. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound accompanying her. The few stragglers had paid and gone hours ago, leaving just her, the diner, and the desert stretching endlessly beyond the glass windows. Then the phone rang. The sharp jangle made her jump. She frowned and stared at the phone mounted on the wall behind the counter. Who would call at this hour? No one ever did. She hesitated before picking up. Hello. Silence stretched across the line. Then, a faint voice broke through, crackling with static. There's going to be a crash, the voice whispered. A truck on Route 15, 3 miles out, at dawn. Marcy's skin prickled. What? Who is this? The line clicked dead. She stood frozen, the receiver pressed against her ear, her pulse racing. A prank, she decided. Some weirdo trying to freak her out. She hung up and shook her head, brushing it off as nothing. By the time she finished cleaning the counter, the strange call was already fading from her mind. The next morning, the crash was all over the news. A semi-truck overturned on Route 15, spilling its cargo and causing a pileup. 3 dead, 2 injured. Exactly where the voice had said it would happen. Marcy stared at the TV mounted in the corner of the diner, her stomach churning. She wanted to dismiss it as a coincidence, but a gnawing unease settled deep inside her. She didn't tell anyone about the call. Who would believe her? That night at precisely 12 a.m. the phone rang again. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. Hello. Tomorrow night, the voice whispered, low and rasping. A fire at the motel on the edge of town. Who are you? Marcy demanded, her voice shaky. What do you want? The line went silent. Then came the click of disconnection. Marcy slammed the phone down, her heart hammering. She couldn't ignore it this time. She called the police, told them about the fire. They dismissed her, their voices tinged with polite disbelief. The next night, the fire consumed the entire motel. 2 people died, their charred remains pulled from the rubble. Marcy watched the footage on the news with a sick feeling in her stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever was calling her, whatever was calling her, knew what was going to happen. The calls kept coming. Night after night, the phone rang at midnight. The voice on the other end recited horrors like a script. A car crash, a drowning, a violent robbery. Each time Marcy tried to warn someone, the police, the victims, anyone who would listen. And each time the tragedies unfolded exactly as foretold. And then the voice turned personal. They're coming for your sister tomorrow. She shouldn't go into town. Marcy's blood ran cold. What? No. Who's coming for her? What are you talking about? You can't stop it, the voice said, eerily calm. No one can stop it. She didn't sleep that night. At dawn, she called her sister, begging her to stay home. But her sister laughed it off and went about her day. By evening, she was dead, struck by a stray bullet during a store robbery in town. Marcy spiraled. The guilt consumed her, and the late-night calls became her obsession. She began waiting by the phone at night, dreading the sound of its ring, but unable to stop herself from answering. She tried to trace the number, but every attempt came up empty. The calls didn't seem to come from anywhere or anyone. One night, she decided to stay late at the diner, determined to confront whoever or whatever was behind the calls. She kept a notebook by the phone, filled with every prediction, every detail, every plea she had made to stop the inevitable. At midnight, the phone rang. Her hand hovered over the receiver, trembling. She let it ring twice before finally picking up. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Why are you doing this to me?" The voice hesitated, as though it hadn't expected the question. "You know who I am," it said finally. The static on the line seemed to deepen, like a low hum crawling under her skin. "No," she whispered. "I don't." The voice grew louder, angrier. "Yes, you do." And then she heard it clearly, her own voice, layered beneath the static. It wasn't just the voice. It was her. Marcy's world tilted. She hung up the phone and stared at it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She stumbled to the office in the back of the diner, pulling up the call logs on the ancient phone system. Her stomach dropped. Every call was listed as originating from the diner itself. The phone had been calling her. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the third night, she felt like she was losing her grip on reality. She refused to pick up the phone at midnight, letting it ring until the sound became unbearable. Finally, on the seventh night, the phone didn't ring. Relief flooded her until it rang 5 minutes later. She hesitated, then snatched the receiver off the hook. "What do you want from me?" she screamed. Her voice was desperate, panicked. "You have to stop. Don't answer the call. You can't answer it." "What are you talking about?" "You'll trap us here. Don't answer." The line cut off abruptly, leaving only the hum of dead air. Marcy's hands shook as she hung up, but her relief was short-lived when the phone rang again. The sound was louder this time, more insistent. Against her better judgment, she picked up. "Hello." There was no answer, only a faint echo of her own voice. Her stomach dropped as realization washed over her. She was no longer on the other end of the call. She was the caller. And as the receiver in her hand crackled to life, she whispered, "There's going to be a crash." The end. The hotel was an architectural marvel, standing tall and resplendent amidst the chaos of the city. Its tagline, "The quietest place in the city," was what drew Amelia Grant, a high-powered marketing executive in desperate need of solace, to its doors. She had spent the past month in unrelenting meetings, client calls, and sleepless nights, her mind a whirlwind of deadlines and demands. The promise of complete silence was irresistible. The lobby was opulent, with polished marble floors, gilded mirrors, and soft ambient lighting. Even with the bustling city just beyond its doors, the air was unnervingly still, as if the sound itself dared not intrude. A concierge with a serene smile handed her a brass key. "Room 1408, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll find it most accommodating." Amelia offered a polite nod, hardly registering the peculiar phrasing, and ascended in the whisper-quiet elevator. She relished the absence of background noise. No dinging elevator chime, no muffled chatter, just silence. When she entered her room, she was struck by its elegance. plush carpets swallowed the sound of her heels as she walked in, and the walls were wrapped in thick, textured fabric. The windows were triple glazed, ensuring no noise from the streets below could seep in. The silence wrapped around her like a warm, invisible blanket. For the first time in weeks, Amelia felt herself exhale. The first day passed in blissful quiet. She worked for a few hours, her laptop the only source of sound. Later she soaked in the oversized tub, letting the absence of noise lull her into tranquility. She fell asleep early, cocooned in the hotel's luxurious silence. But the peace didn't last. Around midnight, Amelia woke up with a start. She wasn't sure why at first. Her room was as quiet as ever. But as she strained her ears, she thought she heard something faint, a soft shuffling sound like footsteps just outside her door. She sat up, her pulse quickening. She waited, the seconds stretching into minutes, but the sound didn't return. Telling herself it was her imagination, she lay back down and eventually drifted off. The next day, Amelia mentioned the noise to the concierge as she passed through the lobby. "I heard footsteps outside my room last night," she said casually. "Is there another guest nearby?" The concierge's smile faltered just slightly. "No, Miss Grant, your floor is entirely unoccupied, except for you. Our soundproofing is unparalleled. It's likely a stray sound from the street below." Amelia frowned but didn't press further. The city was a noisy place after all. That evening, she decided to explore the room. It was something she always did in hotels, a habit born of curiosity. She checked the drawers, ran her fingers along the bookshelves, and peeked inside the closet. It was in the bedside table that she found it, a thick, leather-bound ledger. The book looked old, its cover cracked and edges worn. Inside, names were written in neat handwriting, row after row, each one crossed out in red ink. She flipped through the pages, the unease in her stomach growing. The last entry stopped her cold. The page was blank, save for one name written in fresh ink, Amelia Grant. Her breath hitched. She slammed the ledger shut and shoved it back into the drawer, heart racing. A dozen rationalizations flickered through her mind. Maybe it was a prank, or a coincidence, or something the hotel did as part of its ambience. Still, she couldn't shake the image of her name, written so carefully. That night, Amelia heard the noises again, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, soft and measured, as if someone was pacing just outside her door. Then, a low murmur, too indistinct to make out words. And finally the worst, a child's laughter, high-pitched and chilling, floating through the suffocating silence. Amelia bolted upright in bed, her skin crawling. She rushed to the door and yanked it open, expecting to catch someone in the act. The hallway was empty, bathed in dim, golden light. There were no children in the hotel, she reminded herself. The concierge had said the floor was empty. Her hands trembled as she locked the door and pressed her back against it. For hours she sat awake, listening. The noises continued, faint and relentless, until the first light of dawn. By the third night, Amelia was unraveling. Exhausted and unnerved, she returned to the ledger, drawn to it despite her fear. She flipped through the pages again, stopping at the crossed-out names. Something clicked in her mind. Each name felt oddly familiar, like faces you can't quite place. Then she realized they were names she had seen in the news over the years, missing persons who had vanished without a trace. The realization chilled her to the bone. Desperation overtook her. She stormed down to the lobby, clutching the ledger. "What is this?" she demanded, slamming the book on the concierge's desk. The man didn't flinch. He looked at her with pity, his calm demeanor unchanged. "It's the record of our guests," he said softly. "And now, Miss Grant, it's your turn." She stumbled back, her mind spinning. "What do you mean, my turn? What is this place?" The concierge tilted his head almost sympathetically. "The hotel thrives on silence, you see. It must remain the quietest place in the city, and for that it must feed." Amelia's blood ran cold. She backed away, but the man's voice followed her. "Your screams will be the last sound you make. After that, you'll become part of the quiet." Panicking, Amelia fled to her room, slamming the door shut. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. There never had been. She screamed in frustration, pounding on the walls, her own voice echoing back at her. And then she heard it, her own scream, replaying in a twisted, distorted loop, growing softer with each repetition until it faded entirely. The silence returned, heavier than ever. She turned to see the ledger on her bedside table, though she was certain she had left it downstairs. Her name, once written in fresh ink, was now crossed out in red. The door creaked open. Shadows flooded in, bringing with them a cold, suffocating stillness. Amelia tried to scream again, but no sound came out. When the staff entered her room the next morning, it was pristine, untouched. The bed was perfectly made. The only trace of Amelia was her name, neatly crossed out in the ledger. The silence in room 1408 was perfect once more. The end. The village wasn't on any map. I found it by accident, taking a wrong turn while driving through the winding mountain roads. My GPS had long since lost signal, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks. The golden hues of the fading day made the remote village below seem warm and inviting, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest. Relieved to see signs of civilization, I parked my car near the entrance and walked in. A stone arch marked the gateway, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. A warm, spicy scent filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and music. "Welcome." A man greeted me warmly, his face weathered, but his smile wide. He wore a rough-spun cloak, its edges embroidered with intricate patterns. "You've arrived just in time for our harvest feast." "Oh, I'm just passing through," I said. "I didn't mean to intrude." "Nonsense," he replied, clapping me on the shoulder. "All are welcome at the feast. It is an honor to host a traveler. You must join us. To leave before it is done, well, that wouldn't be wise." There was something in his tone, light but with an undertone that prickled at my nerves. Before I could respond, a group of villagers approached, their smiles almost too wide, too eager. They ushered me toward the village square, where long tables were laid out beneath glowing lanterns, their light flickering green against the twilight. The feast was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Plates overflowed with food, breads, roasted meats, fruits that shimmered as if dusted with gold. The bonfire at the center of the square burned high and bright, its flames an unnatural green that cast eerie shadows over the villagers' faces. "Eat, eat," an elderly woman urged, pressing a plate into my hands. The food smelled intoxicating, but there was something off about it. The meat was too dark, the fruit's juice stained my fingers like ink, and the bread crumbled strangely in my mouth, leaving a bitter aftertaste. I tried to ask questions, where I was, what they were celebrating, but the villagers grew silent, their smiles faltering for the first time. "It's tradition," one of them said finally, before turning back to their food. I should have left then, but the villagers were insistent. watching me with eyes that gleamed in the green firelight. "The feast is sacred," they said. "You must stay until it ends." The music grew louder as the night went on, strange and haunting. I couldn't place the instruments, flutes perhaps, or something like them, but the notes were dissonant, crawling under my skin. I noticed then how the villagers moved, their dancing jerky and stiff like puppets on strings. Their faces seemed to blur in the firelight, their features shifting and shimmering. A cold dread crept into my chest. I tried to leave, making excuses about needing to get back on the road, but the man who had greeted me blocked my path. "The feast is not yet over," he said, his smile sharp now, almost predatory. "To leave before the final fire burns out is forbidden." "Forbidden?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to the tables, where the food seemed to glisten in the firelight, as though sweating. "Eat," he said. "Join the celebration." I ate reluctantly, forcing down bites as the villagers watched. The food, once strange but tolerable, now tasted rancid, and I felt a wave of nausea with every bite. My limbs grew heavy, my head foggy, and the air seemed thicker, pressing down on me like a weight. When I glanced at the fire, I froze. In its flickering flames, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't solid. My form was faint, translucent, as though I were a ghost, or becoming one. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, the image was clearer. My face was pale, my eyes sunken, and my body seemed to shimmer as though unraveling into smoke. "Are you all right?" a woman asked, her voice too sweet, too concerned. "I need to leave," I stammered, standing on shaky legs. The villagers closed in around me. Their smiles were gone now, their faces drawn and haggard, their eyes hollow. The firelight cast deep shadows across their features, and I realized with dawning horror that some of them weren't entirely human. Their skin seemed to ripple, their limbs stretching unnaturally long in the green glow. Their eyes burned with the same unnatural light, and their hands, gnarled claw-like, reached for me. "The feast must go on," the man said, his voice cold and final. I tried to run, but my legs gave out beneath me, my strength drained. The villagers dragged me back to the table, their hands like iron. My reflection in the fire grew fainter with each passing second, the edges of my form dissolving into the flames. "You honor us," one of them whispered, their voice no longer human. "Your sacrifice will sustain us." I struggled, but it was no use. My body felt weightless, as though I were already slipping away. Around me the villagers' true forms were revealed, twisted shadows of the people they had once been, their faces hollow masks, their bodies warped and broken. You're not alive," I gasped. "We were," the man said, his voice echoing with centuries of sorrow. "But life is fleeting. The feast keeps us preserved, sustained, and for that we must take." The green fire roared higher, and I felt its heat consuming me, pulling me in. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was my reflection, faint and flickering, before it vanished completely. The next morning, the villagers celebrated the end of the feast. The bonfire had burned out, and the tables were empty, save for scraps of food. The valley was quiet once more, the air heavy with the scent of ash and earth, and in the green-tinted shadows of the forest, the villagers waited for the next traveler to lose their way. The end. Thunder growled in the distance as 12 strangers shuffled into the grand dining hall of the isolated mansion. The storm had come out of nowhere, the rain hammering against the windows and rattling the old glass panes. Candles flickered on the long mahogany table, casting shadows that danced across the ornately decorated walls. Each guest had received the same invitation, a handwritten card signed only "Your Host," promising an evening of fine dining and entertainment. No one knew who had sent it, but the allure of mystery and the promise of opulence was too tempting to resist. At the head of the table stood an old grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging in eerie silence. Above it hung an oil painting of a masked figure, its gaze following the guests as they took their seats. "Bit odd, isn't it?" muttered a man in a tailored suit as he adjusted his cufflinks. No host, no introductions, and 12 strangers, all gathered in the middle of nowhere, added a woman with sharp eyes in a sleek black dress. Feels like the setup for a murder mystery. The others chuckled nervously, but their laughter faded as one of them pointed toward the table. "Why are there 13 place settings?" The table was set with meticulous care, gleaming silverware, porcelain plates, and crystal goblets. 12 guests, yet 13 chairs. The group exchanged uneasy glances. One chair, positioned near the center, remained empty. Its place setting was identical to the others, save for a silver knife turned blade up on the plate. As the storm intensified, the power flickered and went out entirely. The only light came from the candelabra on the table, their flames casting long shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally. "I don't like this," muttered a nervous young man in glasses. "This is strange." "Strange," said an older woman with a pearl necklace. "It's absurd. No host, no explanation in this storm." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on the empty chair. For a brief moment she thought she saw something, a figure sitting there, its outline faint and flickering like a mirage. She blinked, and the chair was empty again. "Are you all right?" another guest asked, frowning. "Yes, never mind," the woman said, shaking her head. But the unease in her voice was palpable. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere grew heavier, the silence between conversations punctuated by the occasional crash of thunder. The guests tried to keep up small talk, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Then the first disappearance happened. A man excused himself to the bathroom, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Minutes passed, then longer. Someone joked about him getting lost in the mansion, but when another guest went to check, the hallway was empty. The man was gone. He probably stepped outside for air, someone offered, though the storm outside made that unlikely. Then they noticed. The empty chair at the table was no longer empty. A goblet of wine sat half-finished, as though someone had just taken a drink. The whispers started after the second guest disappeared. It was subtle at first, a faint murmuring just at the edge of hearing. The guests looked around, but no one spoke. The whispers grew louder, taking on words they couldn't quite make out. One guest swore they heard their name. Another said the shadows on the walls were moving against the candlelight, creeping toward them like living things. Panic began to rise. "Who brought us here?" demanded a man with a grizzled beard. "This isn't a dinner party. It's some kind of sick joke." "Or a trap," another added, glaring at the others. "Someone here knows what's going on." Accusations flew, tempers flaring as the remaining guests began to suspect one another. That's when the woman with the pearl stood, her face pale as she pointed a trembling finger. "There," she whispered, "the 13th guest. Don't you see them?" The others turned, but the chair was empty. "You're imagining things," the the sharp-eyed woman said, though her voice lacked conviction. There's no one there, but the older woman shook her head. I saw them, standing right behind you. The guests froze, each suddenly feeling the oppressive weight of unseen eyes on their backs. The whispers swirled again, louder this time, forming disjointed phrases. Why did you leave me? Don't you remember? You can't hide. As the night dragged on, the guests began confessing secrets, seemingly compelled by the growing tension. A wealthy businessman admitted to ruining lives with his schemes. A school teacher revealed she'd abandoned a friend in need. Another confessed to an affair that destroyed a marriage. With each confession, the storm outside grew louder, the wind rattling the windows like an angry beast. One by one, the guests disappeared, their chairs left vacant, the remaining goblets filled with wine that none of them had poured, the crimson liquid staining the tablecloth like blood. It wasn't until there were only 3 left, Ryan, the young man with glasses, Sophia, the sharp-eyed woman, and Lila, the woman with pearls, that the truth began to surface. I remember now, Ryan said, his voice trembling. He stared at the empty chair, his face pale and drawn. The accident, we were all there. What accident? Sophia snapped, her tone sharp with fear. The crash, Ryan whispered. A car overturned in the storm, someone was trapped. We left them there. No, Lila said, shaking her head violently. That's not true. I don't remember anything like that. But the whispers grew louder, overlapping with the thunder. You remember, they hissed. You all remember. Ryan stood suddenly, knocking over his chair. It's them, the person we left behind. That's who the 13th guest is. Lila broke into quiet sobs, burying her face in her hands. Sophia glared at the empty chair, her lips curling in defiance. So what? Sophia spat. We can't undo the past. This is ridiculous. But as she spoke, her reflection in the goblet warped, her face twisting into a grim, silent scream. The candles flickered, and when the light returned, Sophia was gone. Only Ryan and Lila remained. Lila clutched Ryan's arm, her pearls rattling against her chest. What do we do? How do we stop this? Ryan shook his head, staring at the chair. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, cold and accusing. You never stopped. You never helped. The chair creaked as the 13th guest finally revealed itself. A shadowy figure, featureless and yet unmistakably human. Its presence was suffocating, its gaze heavy and unrelenting. Please, Leela sobbed. We're sorry. The figure raised a hand, and the last candle went out. When the storm cleared the next morning, the mansion was empty. The dining table sat undisturbed, 13 chairs neatly arranged. The goblets were full, but no one was there to drink. Locals who passed the mansion swore they could still hear the whispers, faint and mournful, calling from within. And the 13th chair remained, waiting. The end. The abandoned radio station sat at the edge of the ghost town, its crumbling facade shrouded in perpetual gloom. Rusted satellite dishes tilted toward a colorless sky, and a faded sign above the entrance read, 103.5, Your Voice in the Void. The door creaked as Alex pushed it open, the stale scent of decay and mildew wafting out. Inside, the sound engineer adjusted their equipment bag, trying to steady their nerves. The job was simple enough on paper: restore the old station's recording systems for a museum exhibit about its infamous final broadcast. The owner had been oddly eager, offering double Alex's usual rate with almost no questions asked. but no amount of money could shake the unease prickling their skin. Everyone in the region knew the story. Decades ago, UA's aired a live broadcast that ended in chaos. The DJ's cryptic, rambling message, something about voices in the static and the signal spreading, was followed by a long, guttural scream and a chilling, high-pitched laugh. Then, static. By morning, listeners across town were dead, some from violence, others from suicide. The survivors claimed to have heard whispers in the static long after the broadcast ended. Alex shook their head, forcing the thought away. It was just a myth, an urban legend blown out of proportion. Their focus needed to stay on the task at hand. The main studio was frozen in time, the equipment coated in a thick layer of dust. A faded calendar on the wall displayed the date of the broadcast, October 27th, 1972. Alex's flashlight swept over an old microphone, still positioned as though waiting for the DJ's voice. They set up their gear, ignoring the eerie silence that seemed to press against their ears. The station was long dead, its power supply severed decades ago. Yet, as Alex connected their equipment to the ancient soundboard, they noticed something odd. The red on-air light flickered faintly. Alex frowned, tapping the bulb. It was likely a trick of the wiring, some residual current. They flipped through the old recordings, finding the reel marked Final Broadcast. With a practiced hand, they threaded it into the reel-to-reel player and pressed play. The static hissed, loud and grating. Then came the voice. "They're here," the DJ whispered, their tone trembling. "They're coming through the signal. Don't listen. Don't let it in." The words cut off abruptly, replaced by the infamous scream and that haunting laughter. Alex flinched as the static that followed seemed to fill the room, pressing against their skull like a vice. The playback system suddenly stopped, rewinding itself with a mechanical whine. "What the hell?" Alex muttered, checking the controls. The machine shouldn't have done that. It wasn't even powered. And then they heard it, faint and distant, as though carried on the wind. A whisper. "Alex." They froze. The sound hadn't come from the reel or their headphones. It had come from the room. Swallowing hard, they spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The room was empty, just as it had been when they arrived. "Get it together," they muttered, turning back to the equipment. But as they leaned closer, the static grew louder, almost like it was alive, and buried within it were other sounds, whimpers, cries, a faint, distorted voice repeating their name. Over the next few hours, the phenomena grew worse. Alex tried playing back other recordings, but the broadcasts were warped, overlaid with eerie transmissions that hadn't been part of the originals. A child's voice sobbing, laughter that wasn't human, and always their name woven through the noise like a taunt. They checked the equipment again, convinced it had to be a glitch. But the cables and circuits were fine. The transmissions weren't coming from the recordings. They were being broadcast live. At one point, Alex's own voice came through the headphones. "I shouldn't have come here," it said, trembling. "It's too late." Alex yanked the headphones off, their pulse racing. They hadn't said those words. They hadn't even thought about them. At least not yet. By midnight, the station seemed alive. The red on-air light burned brightly now, casting the room in an ominous glow. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, shifting even when Alex stood still. The static had become constant, punctuated by faint whispers that grew louder each time Alex tried to ignore them. Desperate for answers, they dug through the station's old logs and files. Most of it was mundane, Scripts, playlists, ad copy. But tucked in the back of a drawer was a handwritten note, scrawled in shaky letters. The signal is alive. It seems. It knows. Don't listen. If you hear it, you're already theirs. The words sent a chill racing down Alex's spine. They stared at the note, the whispers now echoing in their ears, overlapping in an incomprehensible chorus. A sudden crackle burst from the soundboard. Alex turned to see the microphone flicker with life, and then their own voices filled the room. "Why did you come here, Alex?" it said. "You can't fix this. You can't stop it." Alex staggered back, shaking their head. "No, this isn't real. It's a trick." The voice laughed, low and menacing. "You opened the door, the signal spreading, and now you're part of it." The static surged, deafening and oppressive. Alex screamed, covering their ears, but the sound burrowed deep into their mind. They felt it, something ancient and malevolent, crawling through the signal, searching, devouring, and then silence. Weeks later, the station owner visited the site to check on the progress. The equipment was still there, meticulously arranged, but Alex was gone. The only trace of them was an unmarked reel left on the desk. Curious, the owner took it home and played with it. At first it was static. Then came Alex's voice, trembling and broken. "I shouldn't have come here. It's too late. Don't listen. Whatever you do, don't listen." The reel clicked off, but the static remained, and beneath it, faint and insidious, was the sound of laughter. By morning, the owner's body was found slumped over their desk, the reel still spinning. Waz had broadcast once again. The signal was alive. The end. The inn stood alone at the edge of the forest, its ancient beams sagging under centuries of weather. Lanterns cast a faint glow against its timbered walls, their flickering light barely piercing the fog that blanketed the surrounding hills. Jonah pulled his cloak tighter against the chill and stepped inside. The warmth of the hearth greeted him, along with the faint scent of stew and wood smoke. A handful of guests sat scattered about, hunched over bowls or mugs, their voices low and subdued. The innkeeper, a wiry old man with deep-set eyes, approached him. "Welcome, traveler. You're lucky. We've got one room left." Jonah nodded, tossing a few coins onto the counter. The innkeeper handed him a tarnished brass key but held it for a moment before releasing it. His gaze was steady, a warning. "Don't listen to the voices in the walls. Ignore them, no matter what they say." Jonah frowned, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Voices, should I expect a ghost story?" The innkeeper's expression didn't change. "This is no story. Keep your door locked and don't listen. That's all." The room was modest, its furnishings old but functional. The bed creaked under Jonah's weight as he dropped his pack onto it. A small window overlooked the darkened forest, and a single candle on the nightstand flickered weakly against the shadows. He chuckled to himself, recalling the innkeeper's warning. Voices in the walls. Probably just rats. The day's journey had been grueling, and Jonah quickly fell into a restless sleep. Sometime in the night he awoke to a faint sound, whispers. They were barely audible, like a breeze slipping through cracks in the wood. Jonah sat up, rubbing his eyes. The room was still, the candle reduced to a nub. "Who's there?" he called softly. The whispers stopped. Shaking his head, he lay back down, pulling the blanket over himself. Just my imagination, he thought. But as he closed his eyes, the whispers returned, louder this time. "Jonah," his breath caught. It wasn't the tone that unnerved him. It was was the familiarity. The voice was his mother's, soft and trembling, just as it had been the last time he'd seen her. "Jonah," the voice repeated, "why did you leave?" He bolted upright, his heart racing. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself. "It can't be." The whispers continued, growing in number, overlapping like a chorus. Some voices were calm, others accusing, but all of them knew him. "Why didn't you come back? You took what wasn't yours. You could have saved us." Jonah covered his ears, but the voices seemed to bypass the physical world, slipping straight into his mind. He stumbled to the door, his fingers fumbling with the lock, but the voices surged. "Stay, Jonah. Face us. You can't escape." He finally yanked the door open, stumbling into the dimly lit hallway. The inn was eerily silent. The other doors were closed, and no light seeped from beneath them. Jonah pounded on the nearest one. "Hello? Does anyone hear that?" The door creaked open, revealing a man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. He stared at Jonah for a long moment before whispering, "Go back to your room. Don't make it worse." "What's happening?" Jonah demanded, but the man shut the door without another word. Jonah stood there, trembling, until another voice, one he didn't recognize, whispered from behind him, "You can't run." He spun around, but the hallway was empty. By the time dawn broke, Jonah was huddled in the corner of his room, his hands trembling. The whispers had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving him in an oppressive silence that felt even worse. Exhausted, he finally noticed the bedpost. Strange symbols were carved into the wood, symbols that hadn't been there the night before. They were jagged and crude, the grooves fresh. Jonah traced one with his finger, and a chill ran through him. He'd seen this symbol before, in an old book about curses. At breakfast, Jonah sat among the other guests, his plate untouched. He tried to meet their eyes, but they all avoided his gaze, their faces pale and haunted. The innkeeper approached, setting a mug of tea in front of him. "You didn't listen," he said softly. "What is this place?" Jonah hissed, leaning closer. The innkeeper's lips tightened. "A trap for those with guilt. You brought it with you and now it's awake." Jonah shook his head. "I don't understand." "Don't you?" the innkeeper asked, his eyes narrowing. Images flashed through Jonah's mind. His mother's frail face, the debts he left behind, the rival he'd sabotaged to secure his own fortune. He had buried those memories deep, but now they surfaced, clawing at him. Determined to escape, Jonah packed his belongings and headed for the front door. But when he stepped outside, he froze. The forest wasn't there. Instead, the inn was surrounded by endless darkness, the ground beneath his feet dissolving into shadow a few paces from the door. The innkeeper appeared behind him. "There's no leaving until it's done." Jonah turned on him, furious. "What do you mean? Done how?" The innkeeper's face was grim when the voices stopped calling your name. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They listed every wrong Jonah had committed, every betrayal, every moment of selfishness. He screamed back at them, pleading, denying, but it didn't matter. The voices grew into a deafening cacophony, drowning out his thoughts, and then they stopped. Jonah opened his eyes to find the room darker than ever. The candles snuffed out. He stood, but his legs felt weak, his movements sluggish. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, coalescing into shapes, dozens of figures, their faces blurred and indistinct. "You're one of us now," one of them whispered. Before Jonah could respond, the shadows surged toward him, pulling him into the walls. The next morning, the inn looked as it always had. A new traveler arrived, weary and cold. drawn by the flickering lights and promise of warmth. The innkeeper greeted them with a smile and handed them a key. As they turned toward their room, the innkeeper said, "A warning, don't listen to the voices in the walls." From somewhere deep within, faint whispers began to stir. The end. The cornfield stretched out endlessly, its golden stalks swaying in the cool evening breeze. Henry adjusted his gloves and wiped the sweat from his brow, staring out at the rows he had worked all day. The farmer's warning echoed in his mind. "Don't go into the field after dark," Old Man Grady had said, his weathered face deadly serious. "That's when the harvesters come out. They don't take kindly to trespassers." Henry had nodded politely, chalking it up to another small-town superstition. He was here for work, not ghost stories. Harvest season paid well, especially in a place as remote as this. He couldn't afford to be scared off by local folklore, no matter how creepy the old man's tone had been. Now, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the field transformed. Shadows stretched between the rows, and a low, unnatural rustle whispered through the stalks. Henry shook it off as the wind, but a shiver ran down his spine. Back at the farmhouse, Henry wolfed down dinner surrounded by the warmth of the small kitchen. Old Man Grady sat across from him, silently chewing, his gaze fixed on the window. "Storm coming?" Henry asked, trying to make conversation. Grady shook his head. "Not a storm, them." Henry raised an eyebrow. "The harvesters." Grady's fork clattered against his plate. "I'm serious, boy. The lights, the whispers, they ain't no joke. You see anything strange, you get out of that field. Don't look back." Henry smirked. "Got it. Don't mess with the haunted corn." Grady's expression darkened, but he said nothing. That night Henry lay awake in the small bedroom the farmer had offered him. The wind howled outside, carrying faint creaks and groans that might have been the house settling, or something else. Just as he was drifting off, he saw it, a faint orange glow flickering through the window. Curiosity tugged at him. He'd been hearing about these lights since his first day. Surely they had a logical explanation, some prank by local kids, or maybe just equipment left running. Either way, he wanted to see for himself. He grabbed his flashlight and jacket, slipping out into the night. The field was eerily still as Henry stepped between the rows, his flashlight casting long shadows over the swaying corn. The glow was brighter now, flickering like firelight somewhere deep in the field. He pushed forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The rustling started slowly, soft enough that he dismissed it as the wind. But as he moved deeper, the sound grew louder. The stalks whispered against each other like voices, forming words just beyond the edge of comprehension. He paused, the hair on his arms standing on end. "Hello," he called, his voice swallowed by the field. No response. The glow ahead brightened, drawing him onward. As he approached, he saw what looked like lanterns floating above the rows, their light casting strange, shifting patterns. He reached out, but the lights drifted further back, luring him deeper. And then he saw them. The scarecrows were scattered through the rows, their forms barely visible in the dim light. Henry froze, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the closest figure. Its face was a burlap sack, stitched crudely with jagged X's for eyes and a hollow mouth. Straw poked out from its sleeves and collar, but its arms were wrong, too long with claw-like fingers. It was leaning slightly forward as though watching him, A soft whisper floated through the air. "Turn back." Henry's breath hitched. He spun around, but the rows behind him were empty. When he turned back, the scarecrow had moved. It was closer now. His heart raced as he stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The flashlight fell from his hands, its beam slicing through the dark as he scrambled to his feet. More figures emerged from the shadows, their bodies jerking unnaturally as they moved through the corn. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a haunting chorus. "Turn back! Turn back!" Henry bolted. The rows stretched endlessly, the corn towering around him. No matter which direction he ran, the scarecrows were always ahead, their hollow faces staring, their long limbs twitching as they closed in. He tried shouting, screaming for help, but his voice was swallowed by the rustling stalks. The whispers grew sharper, biting at his mind. They weren't random, they were saying his name. "Henry, Henry." He stumbled into a clearing and froze. In the center stood a single scarecrow, larger than the rest. Its burlap face was blank, but its posture was almost human, its clawed hands outstretched as if inviting him closer. Behind it, the lantern-like lights hovered, their glow illuminating a strange wooden altar stained dark with something Henry didn't want to think about. He backed away, his chest heaving. This isn't real. But the scarecrows advanced, their limbs creaking, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. The largest figure stepped forward, its empty face inches from his. A cold, raspy voice spoke directly into his mind. "The harvest requires sacrifice." Henry screamed, the sound ripping through the night. The lights flared, blinding him, and the world dissolved into a blur of whispers and rustling stalks. The next morning, Old Man Grady stood at the edge of the field, his hands clasped tightly around his hat. The town sheriff stood beside him, shaking his head. "Another one," the sheriff muttered, scanning the rows of corn. "That's the third this season." Grady nodded grimly. "It's the price we pay." They didn't bother searching. They never did. The field always gave back what it didn't take. A boot here, a jacket there, but never the worker. As the sun rose higher, the cornfield swayed gently in the breeze. Deep within its rows, a new scarecrow stood, its burlap face stitched with jagged X's for eyes and a hollow mouth. And somewhere in the rustling stalks, whispers carried on the wind. "Henry, Henry." The end. The Appalachian Mountains stretched out endlessly, their peaks shrouded in mist as if guarding some ancient secret. Mia had chosen the isolation of a weathered cabin nestled deep in these woods, hoping it would ignite the creative spark that had eluded her for years. The cabin was sparse but serviceable, a creaking bed, a rickety desk, and a single oil lamp that cast flickering light across her unfinished canvases. Outside, the forest loomed dark and endless, the towering trees whispering in the mountain wind. "This will work," she muttered to herself. "It has to." The first week passed in frustration. Mia's brushes lay untouched, and every blank canvas seemed to mock her. She spent her days staring at the trees and her nights tossing in bed, haunted by dreams of shadows flitting just out of reach. One night, unable to sleep, she stepped outside. The chill bit at her skin, and the forest was eerily silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. That's when she saw it. A shadow detached itself from the darkness between the trees, tall and slender, its edges shifting like smoke. "Who's there?" Mia called, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer but moved closer, its form coalescing into something almost human. "You are lost," it said, its voice soft and hollow, like wind slipping through cracks in the cabin. Despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Mia stayed rooted in place. "I'm not lost," she said, her voice unsteady. The shadow tilted its head. "Not in the woods, in yourself." Mia's breath caught. "What do you want?" "It is not about what I want," the shadow replied. "It is about what you need." She felt an unnatural pull, as if the shadow's words wrapped around her like chains. "What are you talking about?" "You crave success," it said, stepping closer. "I can give it to you. Fame, fortune, admiration, all within your grasp." Mia swallowed hard. "What's the price?" The shadow extended a hand, its fingers long and tapering into nothingness. "A piece of your light, nothing more." Mia hesitated, the weight of desperation pressing down on her. She thought of the mounting bills, the rejection letters piling up, the way her parents' encouragement had turned to pity. "I'll do it," she whispered. The shadow's hand brushed hers, icy and insubstantial. She felt a sharp tug deep within her chest, as if something vital had been plucked away. "It is done," the shadow said, retreating into the forest. "Create." The next morning, Mia woke with a feverish energy. She seized her brushes, and within hours the cabin was filled with stunning landscapes and haunting portraits. Her hands seemed to move on their own, guided by an otherworldly force. She sent her work to galleries, and the response was immediate. Curators clamored for her paintings, collectors offered exorbitant sums, and critics hailed her as a genius. But with each passing day, Mia felt different. Her reflection was the first sign. One evening, as she brushed her hair, she noticed her reflection in the cabin's cracked mirror. It seemed darker, as though a shadow lingered just beneath her skin. Just the lighting, she told herself, but the unease gnawed at her. Her shadow grew darker too, more defined. It didn't move quite as it should, sometimes lagging behind her or stretching unnaturally long in dim light. And then there was the fatigue. Each morning it became harder to get out of bed. The success she had dreamed of was now a reality, yet she felt hollow. The shadow returned after her first gallery show. She stood on the cabin porch, staring into the trees when it emerged once more. "You have done well," it said, "but the light I took was only enough for a beginning." Mia's chest tightened. "You said it would just be one piece." "Fame requires more," the shadow replied. "Do you wish to keep it?" She hesitated. She didn't want to lose everything she had worked for. "Fine," she whispered. The shadow touched her again, and this time the tug felt deeper, more violent. She gasped as the coldness seeped into her bones. Her art continued to thrive, but Mia deteriorated. Her skin grew pale, her movements slow. The world celebrated her work, yet she rarely left the cabin, too weak to face the outside. One night she caught sight of her shadow moving on its own. It stretched across the wall, its form more defined than hers, its movements unnervingly deliberate. "Stop," she whispered, but the shadow only loomed larger, consuming the room in darkness before fading. Desperate for answers, Mia scoured the cabin, searching for clues about the shadow's nature. Deep in a forgotten drawer, she found a faded journal left by a previous tenant. The entries were chilling. "It offered me everything, and I accepted. Now my shadow has taken my place. I see it in the mirror, wearing my face. If you find this, it's already too late." The shadow returned for the final time, standing at the edge of the forest as the moon cast its light through the trees. "You have nothing left to give," Mia said, her voice trembling. "There is one thing left," the shadow replied. "No," she backed away. "I won't let you take it." The shadow didn't respond but stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "You made the bargain," it said. "Now it is complete." Mia's scream echoed through the forest. When the sun rose the next morning, the cabin stood empty, her paintings untouched. In the forest, a new shadow moved among the trees, flickering and insubstantial. It waited, watching for the next desperate soul to come seeking inspiration. The end. The carnival shimmered under the moonlight, its vibrant lights and swirling music beckoning like a siren's song. Jasper ignored the murmurs of the locals who watched him approach from the safety of their doorways, their warnings still fresh in his ears. "Don't go in there," an old man had said, his voice shaking. "People don't come back." Jasper smirked at the memory. Superstition. That's all it was. He lived for thrills, for danger, for stories no one else dared to tell. The carnival, he thought, would be just another chapter in his book of conquests. The gate loomed before him, ornate ironwork adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shift in the corner of his eye. Above it, a sign flickered in red neon. "The Carnival of Echoes. One night only." He stepped through. The air inside was thick and cloying, carrying the scent of spun sugar and something metallic that Jasper couldn't quite place. Stalls lined the dirt paths, offering games, rides, and strange trinkets. The laughter of children mingled with the hum of distant music, but something felt off. The faces of the carnival goers seemed blurred, as if Jasper couldn't focus on them no matter how hard he tried. A vendor approached him, their face obscured by a plain white mask. Looking for a thrill, they asked, their voice muffled yet clear. Jasper nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Then try the mask maker's booth," the vendor said, pointing toward a stall draped in dark velvet. "You'll see who you really are." The booth stood apart from the others, shrouded in shadows. Jasper hesitated before stepping closer, his breath fogging in the chilly air. Behind the counter stood a figure in a long cloak, their face obscured by a mask that shimmered like liquid silver. "Welcome," the figure said, their voice soft and melodic. "You seek to know your true self." Jasper chuckled. "Something like that." The figure produced a tray of masks, each one unique and unsettling. There were masks with exaggerated smiles, hollow eyes, and twisted features. They seemed alive, the colors shifting and swirling as if painted on water. "Choose," the figure said, extending a gloved hand. Jasper's gaze landed on a mask that seemed ordinary compared to the others, smooth porcelain, with delicate features and empty eye holes. It was blank, waiting to be filled. "This one," he said, reaching for it. The figure's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "Are you sure? Once worn, it cannot be undone." Jasper snorted. "Nice sales pitch." The figure released him, and Jasper slipped the mask onto his face. For a moment nothing happened. Then a chill spread across his skin, and he stumbled as dizziness overtook him. When the sensation passed, he reached up to pull the mask off, but it didn't budge. He tugged harder, his panic rising. The mask was fused to his skin. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice echoing unnaturally. The figure behind the counter tilted their head as if amused. "You've made your choice," they said. "Now go. See yourself." Jasper stumbled back into the carnival, his heart pounding. The air felt heavier, the music distorted and strange. As he passed a funhouse mirror, he froze. The mask on his face wasn't blank anymore. It was smiling, a wide, unnerving grin that didn't match the panic he felt inside. He tried to scream, but the mask's expression didn't change. "Help!" he called out, running to a group of carnival goers. They turned to him, their faces vague and indistinct. "I can't get it off." They ignored him, their laughter grating in his ears. He grabbed one by the shoulder, but their form dissolved like smoke under his touch. Jasper stumbled back, staring at his hands. He looked down at his body, but it was solid, wasn't it? He ran to another booth, waving his arms at the masked vendor inside. "You have to help me," he shouted. The vendor tilted their head, silent and unmoving. Behind them a photo booth caught Jasper's eye. He darted inside, his hands shaking as he pressed the button. The flash went off. A strip of photos slid out a moment later, but they were blank. His reflection in the glass of the machine showed nothing but the empty backdrop. "No, no, no," Jasper muttered, backing away. He glanced around the carnival, and the realization hit him like a blow. No one could see him. No one could hear him. He was fading. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time felt slippery here, and Jasper couldn't tell how long he had wandered the endless pathways of the carnival. His mask changed as he walked, shifting to reflect his emotions. A twisted grimace when he cried, a hollow gape when despair overtook him. He stopped trying to talk to people. They were shadows, echoes, flickering in and out of his vision. And then he saw the others. They were like him, their masks grotesque and warped, their bodies faintly translucent. They stood behind booths and rides, their movements mechanical, their eyes empty. Jasper's breath hitched. They weren't just part of the carnival, they were the carnival. He stumbled back to the mask maker's booth, hoping for answers. The cloaked figure was gone. In their place was a tray of new masks, waiting for the next unlucky soul. "No," Jasper whispered, "this can't be it. I'm not staying here." But deep down, he already knew the truth. The carnival didn't just trap its victims, it turned them into part of itself. He had chosen the mask, and now the mask had chosen him. The next time the carnival appeared, 10 years later, a young woman approached the gates. She hesitated, looking at the strange symbols and flickering lights. A figure in a long cloak emerged from the shadows, their face hidden by a porcelain mask. Looking for a thrill, the figure asked, their voice muffled but clear. The woman nodded, her curiosity piqued. The figure gestured toward the mask maker's booth, where a tray of masks shimmered under the moonlight. "Go on," the figure said, their voice tinged with something like sorrow. "See who you really are." Beneath the mask, Jasper smiled. The end. Rumors had swirled around Marshall High for years, whispered between students during lunch breaks, and written in half-legible graffiti on bathroom stalls. Most dismissed the stories as urban legends, but as history teacher Mr. Adam Blake roamed the hallways one late afternoon, he couldn't shake the feeling that some of those stories might hold a grain of truth. The school was empty now, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above him as he walked toward the oldest wing of the building. This section had been closed off years ago, deemed unsafe due to structural concerns. Yet here he was, following a faint draft that tugged at the edges of his curiosity. At the end of the hall he saw it, a door slightly ajar, its frosted glass pane marked with the faint lettering Room 4B. The hinges groaned as Adam pushed the door open. The air inside was cold, stale, and carried the faint scent of chalk dust and old wood. The class classroom was frozen in time. Desks sat in neat rows, each one paired with a chair that hadn't been moved in decades. Open notebooks lay on the desktops, their ink faded but legible. A single apple, shriveled to the size of a walnut, sat on the teacher's desk. Adam frowned as he approached the desk. A roster lay on top, yellowed with age, its edges curling. The names listed were unfamiliar. None of the students matched any from the school's current records. He traced a finger down the list. Names like Molly Pearson and James Keller stood out, their ink strangely bold compared to the rest. At the bottom of the sheet, a note read, "Roll call must be completed by 3:30. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:15. A faint sound broke the silence. Laughter. Adam froze, his ears straining. It was faint, almost like an echo, as if it came from the farthest corners of the room. "Hello," he called out. The laughter stopped. He moved toward the door, a creeping unease settling over him. The hallway beyond was pitch black, though he could have sworn the lights had been on just moments ago. Shrugging off the chill creeping down his spine, Adam stepped back into the classroom. The door clicked shut behind him. When he turned, the knob wouldn't budge. The intercom crackled to life, its static filling the room like a ghostly presence. "Roll call," a distorted voice announced. Adam stared at the roster in disbelief as the names on the list began to echo through the room, one by one. "Molly Pearson." "Present," a soft voice answered from nowhere. "James Keller." "Here," another voice responded, faint but clear. The roll call continued, each name followed by a disembodied reply. Adam's breath quickened as he scanned the room, desperate to find the source of the voices. Then the intercom called, "Adam Blake." The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He didn't answer. The room seemed to grow darker, the corners now shrouded in shadow. The clock on the wall ticked louder, its hands moving unnaturally fast. The intercom crackled again. "Adam Blake." This time the voices of the unseen students joined in, chanting his name in unison. The sound grew deafening, a chorus of echoes reverberating off the walls. Adam shouted, "Who's there? What do you want?" The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The chalkboard at the front of the room now displayed writing that hadn't been there before. Scrawled in jagged white letters were the words, "Finish what we started." Adam stumbled back, his heel catching on the edge of a desk. He hit the floor hard, his head snapping toward a mirror on the far wall. The reflection wasn't his. The man staring back at him wore a threadbare suit, his face lined with age, his eyes hollow and sunken. His own mouth moved without his control, whispering words he couldn't hear. "No," Adam whispered. "This isn't real." The desks began to shift, scraping across the floor as if guided by invisible hands. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, taking on humanoid shapes with blurred, featureless faces. Adam clutched the roster, his hands shaking. The paper felt heavier now, almost warm, as if alive. One of the shadows stepped forward, pointing to the chalkboard. "Read it," a voice hissed. Adam's eyes darted back to the board. Beneath the words, "Finish what we started," new instructions had appeared. "Take the test." A desk in the front row slid forward, its surface now covered with a yellowed test sheet and a pencil. Adam hesitated, but the shadows loomed closer, their whispers building into a low, menacing hum. He sat down. The questions on the test were bizarre, deeply personal, and impossible to answer without confronting parts of himself he had long buried. Why did you abandon them? What could you have done differently? Do you deserve to leave? Tears blurred his vision as he scribbled answers, the pencil, pressing so hard it nearly tore the paper. When he finished, the hum stopped. The shadows retreated slightly, and for a moment the room felt lighter. But then the intercom crackled again. "Failed," the voice announced. The windows shattered, though no glass fell. Instead, beyond the jagged frames was not the forested exterior of the school, but an endless void, swirling with gray mist. The shadows surged forward, enveloping Adam as he screamed. The walls of the classroom warped, the desks vanishing one by one, replaced by rows of faintly glowing figures, the students on the roster. Each face stared at him, their expressions blank, but their eyes filled with accusation. "You're one of us now," they whispered in unison. When the school's janitor found the classroom the next morning, it was empty. The door was ajar, and the room was just as it had been for decades, silent, dusty, and untouched. On the teacher's desk lay a roster. A new name had been added to the bottom: Adam Blake. The end. The coastal village of Greystone was little more than a dot on the map, a place known only for its gray skies and the thick fog that rolled in every few years. The locals called it the Whispering Fog, a weather phenomenon they feared as much as revered. The bus dropped off Claire Fields, a journalist for a small regional magazine, just past noon. The air smelled of salt and fish, and the cobblestone streets were wet from an earlier drizzle. She adjusted the strap of her bag and surveyed the weathered storefronts and crooked homes that made up the village. The place looked as worn as its residents, who avoided her gaze as she passed. Some muttered prayers under their breath. "They think the fog is cursed," her editor had told her with a laugh. "Get the real story, Claire. Science over superstition." At the village pub, Claire met her first source, a fisherman named Elias. His face was etched with lines, and his hands were calloused from decades of work. "It comes every few years," Elias said, his voice low, "always during the fog season. You hear whispers, promises of wealth, voices of loved ones long gone. But it's a trap. Once you follow, you don't come back." Claire smirked, jotting down notes. "Aren't you afraid you'll scare off tourists?" Elias's weathered eyes narrowed. "We're not looking for tourists. You should leave before the fog sets in." "Or what?" Claire asked. "Or you'll hear something you can't ignore." By nightfall, the fog began to creep in, rolling off the ocean in thick, ghostly waves. Claire watched from the window of her rented room as the world outside was swallowed by gray. The whispers started faintly, just a murmur beneath the wind. Claire dismissed it as her imagination, but as the hours passed, the sound grew clearer. "Claire." Her breath caught. The voice was achingly familiar. "Claire, it's me." She froze, her pen hovering above her notebook. It couldn't be. The voice belonged to her brother, Sam, dead for over a decade. The next day, Claire interviewed more villagers, each story eerily similar. "It makes you see what you want most," said an old woman named Martha. "My husband's voice called to me the last time, but it wasn't him." "What did you see in the fog?" Claire asked. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Nothing. I didn't go in. But you still hear it. Always." That evening, the whispers returned. Claire sat in her room, her fingers trembling as she transcribed her notes. She tried to drown out the sound with music, but no matter how loud she turned it, the whispers seeped through. "Claire, come outside." Her chest tightened. She stared at the door, her rational mind at war with the urge to follow the voice. It wasn't possible. Sam was gone. But what if? By midnight, she couldn't resist. Claire wrapped herself in a coat and ventured into the fog. The air was dense and damp, muffling her footsteps and deadening all other sounds. "Sam," she called. The whispers grew louder, guiding her toward the cliffs. Her heart raced as she followed, the rational part of her mind screaming to turn back. But then she saw it. Her childhood home stood just beyond the fog, impossibly out of place. The faded blue shutters and sagging porch were exactly as she remembered. "Claire," Sam stood on the porch, waving. He looked exactly as he had at 16, his face untouched by time. Tears blurred her vision as she ran toward him. "Sam, is it really you?" He smiled, his eyes warm and familiar. "It's me. I've missed you so much." Inside, the house was alive with light and warmth. Their parents sat at the kitchen table, laughing over cups of tea. It was a perfect snapshot of the life Claire had lost. "Stay with us," Sam said, his voice soft. "We can be a family again." Claire hesitated. The house felt too perfect, too untouched by reality. Her investigative instincts flared. "This isn't real," she whispered. Sam's smile faltered. "Why would you say that?" She stepped back, her gaze darting to the windows. The fog outside seemed thicker, pressing against the glass like a living thing. "Where am I?" Her parents turned to her, their faces shifting subtly. Eyes too bright, mouths stretched unnaturally wide. "You're home," they said in unison. Panic set in. Claire turned and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew deafening, and the walls seemed to close in. "Stay," Sam pleaded, his voice now distorted and hollow. "Don't leave us again." Shadows stretched from the corners of the room, slithering toward her. She grabbed a chair and smashed it through the window, leaping into the fog beyond. Claire ran blindly through the haze, the whispers chasing her, calling her name with every step. When she finally stumbled out of the fog, the village was eerily silent. She collapsed onto the cobblestones, gasping for air. The villagers gathered around her, their faces pale with dread. "You heard them, didn't you?" Elias asked. Claire nodded, unable to speak. "You're marked now," he said grimly. "The fog doesn't let go." That night, the whispers followed her into her dreams. Sam's voice was the loudest, repeating the same phrase over and over. "You should have stayed." Weeks later, the fog lifted, and the village returned to its quiet normalcy. But Claire was gone, her room in the inn abandoned, her belongings left untouched. On the cliffs, villagers sometimes claimed to see a figure standing at the edge, her face lost in the mist. And when the fog returned, her voice was among the whispers, calling to the next lost soul. The end. The forest stretched endlessly, its ancient trees towering into a gray, cloud-dappled sky. The Perkins family stood at the edge, their car parked on the narrow dirt road behind them. It had been Tim's idea to take his wife, Laura, and their two kids, Ethan and Abby, on a weekend camping trip. "It'll be good for us," Tim had said. "Get away from the screens, spend some real family time." Laura had reluctantly agreed, though her patience was already wearing thin. The tension between her and Tim had been simmering for weeks, and Ethan and Abby had picked up on it, snapping at each other in the back seat during the drive. The air in the forest was cool, carrying the scent of damp moss and decaying leaves. "This is it," Tim said, forcing a smile. "Fresh air, nature, what more could you want?" Abby, the youngest at 6, clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly. "I don't like it," she muttered. "It's too quiet." Ethan his eyes. "She's scared of everything." "Ethan, be nice," Laura snapped, her tone sharper than intended. She rubbed her temples, already regretting this trip. They set up camp in a small clearing. Tim pitched the tent while Laura unpacked their supplies, the kids wandering nearby to explore. Ethan kept his distance from Abby, grumbling about having to babysit her. It wasn't long before Abby's voice broke through the quiet. "Daddy, come look at this." Tim and Laura followed Abby to a grove of trees just beyond the clearing. The first thing Tim noticed was how still the air felt, as if the forest were holding its breath. The second was the trees. The trunks were wide and gnarled, their bark twisted into shapes that almost resembled human faces. Eyes, mouths, even furrowed brows emerged from the wood, their features frozen in expressions of anguish. Some were faint, barely discernible, while others were so detailed they looked alive. "Whoa," Tim muttered, running a hand over one of the faces. The grooves were deep, the wood cool and rough to the touch. Someone must have carved these. "They're creepy," Ethan said, stepping back. "Why would someone do this?" "They're crying," Abby whispered, her small voice trembling. Tim knelt beside her. "What do you mean?" She pointed at the nearest tree. "I can hear them crying, can't you?" Laura's face tightened. "It's just the wind, Abby. There's no one here but us." But as they stood there, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the faint rustling of leaves falling still. The carved faces seemed to watch them, their hollow eyes following every movement. "Let's head back to camp," Tim said, his voice uneasy. "It's getting late." That night, the whispers began. At first it was faint, just a soft murmuring that could have been the wind. But as the hours passed, the voices grew louder, circling the tent like predators stalking prey. Laura woke first, sitting bolt upright in her sleeping bag. "Tim," she hissed, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Tim groaned but froze as the whispers reached his ears. They weren't words, just an eerie, unintelligible hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Maybe it's animals," he whispered, though the fear in his voice betrayed his words. "Mommy?" Abby's voice was small, trembling. "They're here." Tim unzipped the tent flap and shone a flashlight into the trees. The beam sliced through the dark, revealing nothing but the gnarled forest. But something felt off. The trees looked closer than they had earlier, their twisted faces clearer in the beam's light. "Go back to sleep," he said, though his hands were shaking. "It's just the wind." By morning, the tension in the family was palpable. Laura and Tim argued quietly as they packed their things, trying not to let the kids hear. "I told you this was a bad idea," Laura snapped. "This place is wrong." "It's just an old forest," Tim said, though he avoided meeting her eyes. "You're letting your imagination get to you." Abby tugged on Laura's sleeve. "Mommy, can we go home now? We're leaving," Laura said firmly. "Right now." But leaving wasn't so simple. The path back to the car twisted in ways it hadn't before. Tim swore they were heading the right way, but the forest looped endlessly, bringing them back to the clearing no matter which direction they walked. The trees seemed to close in, their faces more pronounced, their anguished expressions etched deeper into the bark. "We're lost," Ethan muttered, his voice wavering. "We're not lost," Tim snapped, though his voice cracked. He turned on Laura. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? To ruin the trip? Are you serious right now?" Laura shot back, her face flushing with anger. "You dragged us out here." The whispers returned, louder than before. Abby clutched her rabbit tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. "Stop yelling," she begged. "They're watching." By late afternoon, the family had stopped speaking to each other. Exhaustion and fear weighed heavy on them, their footsteps dragging as they stumbled through the endless maze of trees. Then Ethan froze. "Wait, what is that?" The others followed his gaze to a nearby tree. Its bark had split open, revealing a new face. Ethan's face, his wide eyes and panicked expression captured an uncanny detail. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "Why is it me?" Tim stared at the carving, his mind racing. "It's not you," he said, though the words rang hollow. But as they moved deeper into the forest, they saw more faces. Laura's, Tim's, Abby's. Each one appeared on a different tree, their expressions twisted in fear or anguish. "They're us," Laura whispered, horror dawning on her face. "It's showing us." The whispers swelled louder now, repeating their arguments, their angry words, their secrets. As night fell again, the family was back in the clearing where they'd started. Their tent was gone, replaced by a circle of trees with their faces carved into the bark. The forest was alive with whispers, echoing every harsh word, every secret they had tried to bury. "This isn't real," Tim muttered, pacing in frantic circles. "It can't be real." "It's punishing us," Laura said, her voice hollow. "For fighting, for everything." Abby clung to her mother, her tears soaking into Laura's jacket. "Mommy, I don't want to stay here." The ground trembled as the forest closed in, the trees leaning toward them. The Perkins family screamed, their voices blending with the whispers. By morning, the forest was silent. To passing hikers, the grove looked no different from any other part of the woods. But if you looked closely, you'd notice the faces in the trees. A man, a woman, a boy, and a little girl. Their features were etched in exquisite detail, their expressions frozen in eternal anguish. And if you stood too long, you'd hear the whispers. "Stay with us." The end. The mouth of the cave yawned open before them, a black void cutting into the rocky hillside. 4 spelunkers stood at the entrance, their headlamps casting narrow beams of light into the darkness. Sarah adjusted the straps of her pack and glanced at the others. Ben, the team leader, Elena, the geology expert, and Marcus, whose jokes and easygoing demeanor usually kept the mood light. But now, even Marcus seemed tense, his gaze fixed on the shadowed interior of the cave. "This is it," Ben said, his voice echoing faintly. "The locals call it the Whispering Depths. They say you can hear your own voice talking back to you, some sort of acoustic anomaly." Sarah swallowed, her excitement tempered by a gnawing unease. The reports had drawn them here. Claims of whispers, strange echoes, and inexplicable disappearances. It was all perfect fodder for their exploration blog, a mix of adventure and mystery that kept their followers hooked. "All right," Ben said, "lights on and stay close. The mapping equipment is ready. Let's find out what's down there." The first chamber was vast, its ceiling disappearing into the shadows above. Their voices bounced off the walls, distorted and overlapping in eerie layers. Every step they took seemed to produce an unnatural echo, faint and delayed, as if the cave were considering each sound before returning it. "Hello," Marcus called, his voice loud and playful. The echo that followed was unsettling, slower and quieter, almost like someone else had spoken the word. "Creepy," Elena muttered, her eyes darting around the chamber. "The acoustics don't make sense. It shouldn't echo like that." Ben shrugged. "That's why we're here, isn't it?" They pressed deeper into the cave, navigating narrow tunnels and steep descents. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. The echoes became stranger. They didn't just repeat their words, they shifted, stretching syllables or cutting them short. Sometimes Sarah thought she heard her voice coming from a direction she hadn't spoken toward. Several hours in, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely distinguishable from the echoes. A low murmur that grew louder as they ventured deeper. Sarah paused, her hand on the rough stone wall. She swore she'd heard her name. Sarah, the whisper came again, soft and insistent. It was her own voice. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Ben asked, glancing back at her. "It said my name," she whispered, her words barely audible. "I think it was my voice." Marcus chuckled nervously. "You're freaking yourself out. It's just the echoes." But the others weren't so sure. Elena's brows furrowed, and she muttered something under her breath, her grip tightening on her flashlight. As they pressed on, the whispers grew bolder. They didn't just echo their words, they spoke their thoughts. "Why did you even come here?" Sarah heard the whisper say. "You're terrified of the dark." She froze. That thought had been hers, unspoken, buried deep in her mind, but now the cave was speaking it aloud. "What the hell is this?" Elena snapped, turning to Ben. "This isn't normal." Ben's jaw tightened. "Keep moving. We'll figure it out later." But there was no later. The whispers intensified, taking on familiar voices. Sarah heard her mother's voice, pleading and broken. "Sarah, help me. Please, I'm scared." Her legs wobbled as she staggered to the side of the tunnel. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Her mother was safe at home, 100 miles away. The others were hearing things too. Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering under his breath. Elena stopped responding altogether, her face pale and stricken. Only Ben kept his composure, though even he looked rattled. When Marcus vanished, it happened without warning. They were descending a steep incline when his light flickered and went out. By the time they turned back, his pack lay abandoned on the ground, his voice echoing faintly down an adjacent tunnel. "Marcus," Sarah shouted, her voice shaking. The response came in his voice, but it was wrong, flat and hollow, like a recording played backward. "Turn back," the distorted voice said. "Please." Elena screamed and bolted. Ben shouted after her, but she disappeared into the darkness, her footsteps fading into silence. Moments later they heard her voice, high-pitched and overlapping with itself in impossible layers. Now it was just Sarah and Ben. "We need to leave," she said, gripping his arm. "We have to get out." He nodded, his face drawn and pale. But when they turned to retrace their steps, the tunnel seemed different, unfamiliar. The whispers grew deafening, swirling around them, coming from all sides. "Why didn't you stop them?" the whispers accused. "Why did you let them die?" Ben clutched his head, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "Shut up," he screamed. His voice reverberated, bouncing back at them in distorted fragments. "Shut up, shut up, shut." He bolted into the dark, leaving Sarah alone. The silence that followed was unbearable. Sarah stood frozen, her light shaking in her trembling hand. The air felt heavy, as though the cave were alive, breathing around her. She tried to steady herself, but the whispers crept closer, crawling into her ears. "You don't belong here," they hissed. "This is your fault." She stumbled forward, desperate to find the exit, but the tunnels twisted and changed with every step. Her own voice taunted her now, cruel and mocking. "Everyone's gone because of you." The flashlight flickered and she saw something ahead, a faint glow. She ran toward it, her heart pounding. The glow was a mirror. She froze, staring at her reflection, or what should have been her reflection. The figure in the mirror was wearing her clothes, carrying her flashlight, but its face was blank. The whispers fell silent as the figure raised a hand and pressed it to the glass. Then the whispering started again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from around her, it was coming from her. Sarah stumbled back, the mirror disappearing into the dark. She ran, but the tunnels were endless. The air grew colder, her legs heavier. She could hear her voice ahead of her, calling to someone. "Turn back," it said. "Please, turn back." But no one answered. When the next expedition team found the cave a gate later, they discovered equipment and belongings scattered throughout the tunnels. They marveled at the strange echoes that seemed to follow them, faint voices that almost sounded human. And among the whispers, a single plea stood out, soft and desperate. "Turn back. The end." The clock tower loomed over the decaying city like a sentinel, its jagged silhouette cutting through the night sky. For decades it had stood silent, its gears frozen in time. The townsfolk avoided it, muttering about curses and bad omens. Legends whispered of its toll at midnight, a sound reserved for those destined to die within 24 hours. Sarah didn't believe in legends. The university student stood at the base of the tower, staring up at its dark face. Her camera hung around her neck, ready to document the haunted landmark for her final urban folklore project. This was her last shot at passing the class, and the clock tower, with all its grim history, seemed perfect. Pulling her jacket tighter against the chill, she clicked on her flashlight. The rusted door creaked open with a push, its groan swallowed by the wind. She stepped inside. The air within was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. Sarah's flashlight swept across the interior, revealing a spiraling staircase disappearing into darkness above. Broken gears and shattered clock hands lay scattered across the floor like the skeleton of some ancient beast. "It's just an old building," she muttered, more to herself than to the oppressive silence. Her voice echoed faintly, unsettlingly, as though the tower itself was listening. She began to climb. The stairs groaned underfoot, each creak reverberating up the hollow shaft of the tower. Her flashlight flickered as she ascended, its beam catching glimpses of graffiti scrawled along the walls. Names, dates, cryptic messages like, "Don't stay past midnight and it's watching." Sarah swallowed hard and kept moving, her fingers trailing along the cold metal railing. At the top, she found the clock's heart, a massive, dormant mechanism, its gears tangled with cobwebs. The clock face was visible from inside, its glass fractured but intact. Midnight was approaching, the hands frozen at 11:58. Sarah set her camera on a tripod, the lens aimed at the ancient machinery. She checked her watch. 2 minutes to go. "Let's see if this legend has any truth to it," she said, forcing a smirk she didn't feel. Then the tower shuddered. A low groan reverberated through the walls as the gears began to turn. The ancient clock hands jerked forward with a grinding screech, snapping into motion. Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the ground. She watched in stunned silence as the minute hand crept toward midnight. The first chime rang out, deep and resonant, shaking the entire tower. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the sound burrowed into Sarah's chest, vibrating her bones. She covered her ears, but the chime echoed inside her head, impossible to block out. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely discernible over the hum of the tower's awakening. but as the second chime struck, they grew louder, swirling around her like a tangible force. "Sarah." She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar, too familiar. "Mom," she whispered, spinning toward the sound. The room was empty, but the voice came again, pleading, broken. "Why did you leave me?" The third chime rang, and the world tilted. When Sarah blinked, she was no longer in the tower. She stood in the middle of the city, but it was different, wrong. The streets were empty, the buildings distorted, their windows staring like hollow eyes. A thick fog clung to the ground, swallowing the edges of her vision. "Hello," she called, her voice swallowed by the eerie silence. A figure emerged from the fog, a woman, her features unnervingly familiar. Sarah's breath hitched as she recognized her roommate, Jess. But something was off. Jess's face was pale, her eyes sunken, and her mouth twisted into a grim smile. "You shouldn't have gone into the tower," Jess said, her voice hollow. "You can't leave now." "What are you talking about?" Sarah demanded, backing away. "This isn't real." Jess tilted her head, her neck bending too far, as though her spine were made of rubber. "Midnight's coming. You can't stop it." Sarah turned and ran, her footsteps echoing unnaturally in the empty streets. The fog thickened, swallowing the buildings and distorting her surroundings. She turned corner after corner, but the city refused to let her go. Every street led back to the same spot, the clock tower. The fourth chime struck as she reached the base of the tower again. Its sound rippled through the fog, bending the air like heat waves. Figures began to emerge from the haze, people she recognized, but not as they should be. Her mother was there, her face gaunt and gray. Jess stood beside her, her limbs twitching as though moved by invisible strings. Behind them were others, her childhood best friend, a professor she'd admired, even the barista she saw every morning. Their eyes were dark, their movements jerky and wrong. They spoke in unison, their voices overlapping in a chilling chorus. "You shouldn't have come here." The fifth chime rang, louder than the rest. Sarah fell to her knees, clutching her head as the sound overwhelmed her senses. The figures moved closer, their faces melting into grotesque parodies of themselves. "You can't run," they whispered. "The clock always collects." When the sixth chime struck, Sarah was back inside the tower. The gears turned furiously, the machinery grinding as the hands crept toward midnight. The whispers echoed through the chamber, growing louder with each second. Her camera was still on the tripod, its lens cracked but recording. In its viewfinder, Sarah saw herself, but not the way she should have been. Her reflection in the camera's feed was distorted, her eyes hollow and her mouth stretched into a soundless scream. "No," she whispered, backing away from the camera. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The seventh chime struck and the room darkened. The glass of the clock face shattered inward, shards raining down as a black void yawned open where the face had been. The whispers became a roar, and Sarah felt herself being pulled toward the void. She dug her heels into the floor, clawing at the metal grates, but the pull was relentless. The voices grew deafening, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Your time is up." The final chime rang out. The sound was absolute, consuming everything. The pull of the void intensified, and Sarah screamed as she was dragged into the darkness. Her last thought was of the camera still recording, capturing every moment. Then there was silence. When the townsfolk passed the clock tower the next morning, they paused. For the first time in decades, the hands had moved. They now rested at 12:01. Inside, the camera sat on its tripod, untouched. The recording was still running, its screen showing nothing but static. But if you listened closely, buried beneath the hiss, you could hear a voice. "Help me. The end." It wasn't on any map. The decrepit Carnival appeared at the edge of town overnight, its rusted gates creaking in the wind. From the highway, bright lights flickered faintly, their colors muted by grime, and the faint echo of carnival music drifted into the night. For Leah and her friends, it was too tempting to resist. "An abandoned carnival. This is perfect," said Connor, a grinning thrill-seeker who had dragged them into more dangerous situations than Leah cared to count. "I don't know," Leah said, staring uneasily at the dilapidated sign overhead. The paint was peeling, and the words "Carnival of Wonders" hung lopsided as though trying to escape their frame. "Come on," Connor urged. "We can check it out and leave if it's boring." "It's trespassing," Beth, the cautious one of the group, muttered, pulling her jacket tighter against the chilly wind. But despite her protests, the group pushed through the rusted gates, their footsteps crunching on gravel. Inside, the carnival was strangely alive. The carousel spun slowly, its painted horses frozen in mid-leap. Strings of faded lights blinked overhead, and the scent of popcorn wafted faintly on the breeze. Game booths lined the midway, their prizes still hanging neatly on display. "See," Connor said, spinning in a circle. "This is awesome." "No staff," Leah said, frowning. "No other people." Beth pointed toward the Ferris wheel, its rickety frame creaking as it turned. "How is that still running?" None of them had an answer. They wandered deeper into the carnival, their unease growing with every step. Connor was the first to break away, spotting a basketball game booth. "Oh man, I gotta try this." "Connor, wait." Leah began, but he was already at the booth, grabbing a dusty ball. He tossed it, the ball swishing cleanly through the hoop. Lights flashed and a mechanical voice boomed, "Winner." Connor grinned as a massive teddy bear dropped into his arms. "This place rules." But as he turned back to the group, Leah noticed something strange. His face seemed off, paler, and his grin didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's keep moving," she said uneasily. As they passed a fun house, Beth hesitated. The entrance was flanked by grinning clown statues, their painted faces chipped and faded. The air seemed colder here, and Leah swore she heard faint whispers coming from inside. "I don't think we should go in there," Leah said, but Beth was already stepping through the doorway. "I'll just look around." Leah glanced at Connor, who shrugged. "She'll be fine." Minutes passed. Beth didn't return. "Beth," Leah called, stepping cautiously into the funhouse. Inside, warped mirrors lined the walls, reflecting distorted versions of herself. Some stretched her figure impossibly tall, others squashed her into a grotesque parody. "Beth," she shouted again. A muffled scream echoed from deeper within, followed by laughter, high-pitched, maniacal, and wrong. Leah turned to run but found herself staring into a mirror that didn't reflect her. Instead, it showed Beth, her face twisted in terror as shadowy clown figures dragged her deeper into the glass. Panicked, Leah stumbled out of the funhouse and found Connor near the carousel, his face eerily blank. "We need to leave," she said, grabbing his arm. Connor didn't respond. He stared at the carousel, its horses now grotesque, their painted smiles warped into snarls. "Connor," Leah shouted, shaking him. Finally he turned to her, but his eyes were glazed, his skin pale. "I need to ride," he murmured, stepping toward the carousel. "No," Leah screamed, but it was as if he couldn't hear her. climbed onto one of the horses and the carousel began to spin faster. The music warped, its cheerful tunes slowing into a haunting dirge. As the ride spun, Connor's face blurred, his features melting away until he was no longer recognizable. When the carousel slowed, the horse he had ridden stood empty, its mouth twisted into a scream. Leah was alone now. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she sprinted toward the exit. But when she reached the gate, it was gone. In its place stood a wall of mirrors, each one reflecting her face in terrifying ways. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. The mirrors began to ripple and figures emerged, Beth, Connor, and others she didn't recognize. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes black pits. "You came here," Beth's voice said, though her lips didn't move. "You wanted to see." Connor's voice followed, colder. "Now you're part of it." Leah turned and ran, her legs heavy as if the ground were pulling her down. She stumbled into a tent with faded red stripes, its interior filled with broken carnival games and torn posters. In the center of the tent was a large, cracked mirror. She saw her reflection, haggard, terrified, clutching her chest. But as she stared, the reflection changed. The figure in the mirror smiled, its face calm and confident, its eyes gleamed with malice. "No," Leah whispered, stepping back. The figure stepped forward. The mirror shattered. The next morning the carnival was gone. All that remained was an empty field, the grass trampled and the faint scent of popcorn lingering in the air. In a nearby town, a flyer appeared on a lamppost. "Carnival of Wonders coming soon." Beneath it, in faded letters, a warning was scrawled, "Don't go in." The end. The puppet theater sat on the edge of the village, its ornate facade cracked and weathered by time. Locals whispered that the building was cursed, its former owner having vanished under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Emil dismissed the rumors as superstition. The theater was his inheritance, a gift from an uncle he barely remembered. The first time Emil stepped inside, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty air. Dust coated every surface, and the scent of mildew clung to the faded velvet curtains. Rows of empty seats stared at the stage, which was flanked by wooden cabinets. Inside one, he found them, a collection of marionettes, each carved with stunning detail. Their glass eyes seemed to follow him as he worked to restore the theater. At first he tried not to notice their lifelike features, the faint curl of a lip, the almost human proportions of their hands. But as he strung them up and tested their movements, he couldn't deny the craftsmanship. They felt alive in his hands, responding to his slightest touch with eerie precision. The villagers were reluctant to attend his reopening performance. Emil offered free tickets, plastering posters across the village square. On opening night, the theater was barely half full, but those who came left spellbound. Emil's marionettes moved with uncanny grace, their wooden limbs bending in ways no human hand could replicate. By the final act, the audience sat in stunned silence, erupting into applause as the curtains fell. The first sign something was wrong came a week later. Emil stood before his mirror, brushing lint from his jacket before a performance. As he turned to leave, he noticed his reflection lingered a split second too long. He stared at the glass, convinced it was a trick of the light. That night, as he performed, he felt his movements grow erratic. The marionettes danced and bowed with their usual lifelike elegance, but Emil's hands jerked clumsily, as though fighting against invisible strings. He blamed exhaustion and pushed through, ignoring the whispers from the audience about the strange way his body moved. The diary was hidden in a drawer backstage, bound in cracked leather. Emil found it while searching for replacement strings for a marionette. The script inside was spidery and faded, detailing the theater's history. At first it was mundane, notes on performances, sketches of set designs, but deeper in the diary, the tone darkened. The puppets must be fed, one entry read. To make them live, one must give, a fragment of the soul, just enough to animate. Emil slammed the book shut, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. He laughed nervously. It had to be a joke, a morbid creative exercise by his uncle. But as he glanced at the marionettes hanging silently in the corner, the laughter died in his throat. One of them was smiling. He was sure it hadn't been before. The next morning, Emil awoke with an ache in his limbs. His knees cracked as he stood, his arms felt stiff, and his fingers twitch involuntarily. His reflection in the mirror made his stomach churn. His posture was slouched, his neck tilted at an unnatural angle. He stretched and rubbed at his joints, but the stiffness lingered. During that night's performance, he noticed something horrifying. As he guided the marionettes, their motions became smoother, more fluid, while his own became more jagged. His feet stumbled, his arms jerked, his head snapped side to side with the rhythm of the puppet's dance. The audience didn't seem to notice. They were too mesmerized by the lifelike marionettes. Backstage, Emil collapsed into a chair, his chest heaving. He stared at his hands, now trembling and pale. When he glanced at the puppets, they seemed to lean toward him, their blank faces glowing in the dim light. "They're feeding on me," he whispered to himself. "They're taking me." Desperation drove him back to the diary. He flipped through the brittle pages, searching for answers. One passage stopped him cold. The soul frays piece by piece, first the movements, then the mind, and finally the body. The puppets will claim what was given, and when the puppet master is empty, he joins their stage. The words hit him like a hammer. Emil tried to convince himself it wasn't real, that he wasn't being consumed by the theater's cursed legacy. But when he looked down at his hands, the truth was undeniable. His skin was taking on a wooden sheen, his joints stiffening as though carved from pine. On the night of the final performance, Emil resolved to destroy the puppets. He arrived at the theater with a can of kerosene, determined to burn it all to the ground. The villagers had gathered in droves, filling the seats and buzzing with excitement. He tried to focus, waiting for the moment the curtains would fall and the audience would leave. But as the show began, something seized him. His legs carried him to the stage, his arms lifting the marionettes with unnatural grace. He wasn't guiding them anymore, they were guiding him. The audience watched in awe as Emil and the marionettes performed a stunning, synchronized routine. His body moved like one of them now, jerking and bending as though on invisible strings. Inside, he screamed, but no sound came out. His limbs belonged to the puppets, his mind trapped in a fog. The show ended with thunderous applause. As the curtains fell, Emil staggered backstage, his vision blurring. His body no longer felt like his own. He collapsed to his knees, clutching at his chest, gasping for air. When he looked up, the marionettes were gathered around him. Their faces were no longer blank, they were alive, their glass eyes sparkling with malice. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices high and hollow. The next morning, the villagers found the theater doors open. Inside, the stage was empty, save for a new marionette hanging at the center. It was carved with exquisite detail, from its pale face to its trembling hands. It looked exactly like Emil. The villagers marveled at the craftsmanship, murmuring among themselves about how lifelike it seemed. None of them noticed the faint movement in its glass eyes or the way its wooden lips twitched into a silent scream. On the next performance night, the marionette that resembled Emil danced with the others. The audience was enraptured, their applause thunderous as the puppets bowed in perfect unison. But if you listened closely, beneath the music and cheers, you could hear it. A faint, desperate whisper, trapped inside the wooden frame. "Help me. The end." It started with a headline: "Fifth resident missing in 2 months. Police baffled." When my editor assigned me the story, I wasn't thrilled. Black Hollow was a speck on the map, a rural town surrounded by endless wheat fields. The kind of place where the biggest news was the annual harvest festival, or the occasional bar fight. But 5 missing people, that was something. I arrived on a drizzly afternoon. The town felt as empty as the fields that stretched for miles around it. Locals shuffled past, their eyes downcast, their mouths tight. No one wanted to talk about the disappearances, except for Harold Tate. Harold was the town historian, a wiry man with glasses too big for his face. When I introduced myself and mentioned my story, he perked up. "You should come by the archive," he said. "There's something you need to see." The archive was a dusty room in the basement of the town hall, crammed with old newspapers, yellowing photographs, and forgotten ledgers. Harold handed me a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. "This belonged to Jonathan Black," he said, "the town's founder." I opened it, and the first thing I noticed was the handwriting, jagged and uneven, as though written by a trembling hand. The entries were dated in the early 1800s, and they started innocuously enough. Notes about crop yields, the weather, the struggles of building a community in the wilderness. But then, about halfway through, the tone changed. July 12th, 1805. I saw it today. A figure at the edge of the fields, tall and black as a shadow against the golden wheat. It did not move, but I could feel its gaze upon me. When I looked again, it was gone. July 17th, 1805. The figure returns each night, always at the edge of the fields, always watching. I dare not approach it. Something about it feels wrong, unnatural, as if it is not truly there, yet somehow more real than anything I've ever known. July 22nd, 1805. Samuel Bell is gone. He vanished last night after claiming he'd seen the figure near his barn. I fear the two are connected. The Watcher, as I've come to call it, appears to mark its victims. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling. "What happened to Jonathan Black?" I asked. Harold pushed his glasses up his nose. "Disappeared," he said simply, "like the others." I stared at the journal, unease creeping into my chest. It was just an old book, a collection of paranoid ramblings. But the disappearances in Black Hollow weren't history. They were happening now. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. My room overlooked the wheat fields, the golden stalks rippling under a pale moon. I sat at the desk, poring over the journal, trying to connect the dots. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood at the edge of the fields. It was just as Jonathan Black had described, tall, black as shadow, its edges blurry and indistinct. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, cold and heavy, pressing against my chest. I blinked, and it was gone. The next day, I interviewed the families of the missing. None of them wanted to talk, but I noticed the same look in their eyes. A haunted, hollow stare, like they'd seen something they couldn't explain. By the time I returned to the motel, the sun was sinking behind the fields, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. I closed the curtains, but it didn't help. Every time I glanced out the window, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow that shouldn't be there. That night, I dreamed of the watcher. It stood at the foot of my bed, its face, or lack of one, tilting downward to study me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as its presence pressed against me like a weight. When I woke, my chest was tight, and my sheets were soaked with sweat. I returned to the archive the next morning, desperate for answers. Harold wasn't there, so I let myself in and searched the records. That's when I found it. A newspaper article from 1937. Farmer claims dark figure stalked his land before disappearance of family, and another from 1972. Witness reports shadowy figure near site of missing hiker. Over and over, the same details, a shadowy figure at the edge of the fields, a sense of being watched. Then someone vanishes. The more I read, the more I felt it, that weight, the sense of eyes on the back of my neck. I turned to the window. It was there, closer this time, standing just beyond the parking lot. Its edges seemed to ripple like heat waves rising off asphalt. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of books, and when I looked again, it was gone. I should have left. I should have packed my bags and driven away without looking back. But I couldn't. Instead, I returned to the journal, flipping through its brittle pages until I reached the final entry. August 4th, 1805. I've made a terrible mistake. The watcher is not a man, nor a beast, nor even a shadow. It is a hunger, a thing that exists only in the act of being seen. By looking for it, I have bound it to me. It will not stop until it has me. The words sent a chill down my spine. I slammed the journal shut, my heart hammering. Outside, the sun was setting, and the wheat fields glowed like liquid gold. I looked out the window. It was there, closer now, standing at the edge of the lot. My breath caught as I realized its head was tilted, as if watching me with curiosity or hunger. I grabbed my things and ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I looked up, it was gone. Or so I thought. As I sped down the empty road, the field stretching endlessly on either side, I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was in the back seat. The last thing I remember is swerving off the road, the car plunging into the fields. The wheat closed around me like a shroud. And then, nothing. They found the car a week later, empty. The official report called it an accident, but the locals knew better. In the distance, at the edge of the fields, the watcher waits for someone else to see. The end. It started as a dare. The five of us, me, Kara, Ryan, Jules, and Max, huddled in the dimly lit common room of Blackwood boarding school, our faces glowing in the eerie light of a single candle. Outside, the forest pressed against the windows, branches clawing like skeletal fingers at the glass. "Let's play the mirror game," Kara whispered, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Everyone else hesitated. The mirror game was an old-school legend, whispered about in the dorms late at night. The story went that if you stood in front of a mirror at midnight and chanted, "Show me what you see, let me in to be free," You could summon a spirit that lived inside the glass. No one believed it, of course, but the stories always ended the same. The spirit would find a way to trade places with you. Ryan laughed nervously, running a hand through his messy hair. It's just a stupid game. Nothing's gonna happen. Scared, Ryan? Jules teased, smirking. I'm not scared, he shot back, his bravado slipping. Max shrugged. I'll do it. Someone has to prove it's fake. We gathered in front of the long mirror mounted on the common room wall. The glass was old and slightly warped, its surface rippling like water. As the clock struck midnight, Max lit the candle and held it beneath his face, casting flickering shadows over his features. Ready? Kara asked, her voice trembling. We all nodded, our reflections mimicking the motion. Okay, Max said, raising the candle. Let's do this. Together we chanted, show me what you see, let me in to be free. Our voices echoed softly in the room, overlapping with a strange resonance. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror reflected our pale faces, our wide eyes, and the guttering flame of the candle. The glass was perfectly normal. No ghostly figures, no flickering shapes, just us. See, Ryan said, exhaling in relief. It's all just... The candle went out. We gasped, plunging into darkness for a brief, heart-stopping moment. The room felt wrong, like the air was heavier, thicker. Then Jules fumbled for the matches, relighting the candle. Creepy, she muttered, but we all laughed nervously. The tension broke and we scattered back to our dorms. The first thing I noticed was Max. The next morning, he seemed off. At breakfast, he barely spoke, just staring down at his plate with a strange, unfocused expression. When I nudged him, he flinched, like I'd startled him out of a dream. You okay? I asked. He looked at me, and for a split second his eyes seemed wrong. Too bright, too wide. Then he blinked, and he was just Max again. Yeah, he said, just tired. But that night, as I passed the common room on my way to bed, I saw him standing in front of the mirror. The room was dark except for the pale glow of moonlight, and Max was staring at his reflection unmoving. Max, I called softly. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed his reflection. It wasn't quite right. The real Max was standing still, but in the mirror, his reflection's head was tilted slightly to the side, lips curved into a faint, unnatural smile. Max, I snapped, grabbing his arm. He jumped, blinking rapidly, and turned to me. His reflection followed a half-second too late. What are you doing? I demanded. He looked confused. Nothing, I don't know. He glanced at the mirror, shivering. It's nothing. Let's go. By the third day, Kara was acting strange, too. She started avoiding mirrors, covering them with scarves or turning them to face the wall. When I pressed her about it, she just shook her head and muttered, I don't want to see it. I don't want it to see me. What are you talking about? I asked, but she refused to explain. Then Jules disappeared. She was there one moment, laughing with us in the dining hall, and gone the next. Her things were still in the dorm, tapped her phone left on her bed. The teacher said she must have run away, but we all knew better. She's gone, Kara whispered that night, her voice shaking. It got her. What got her? I demanded, but she wouldn't answer. The next time I looked in a mirror, I saw it. I was brushing my teeth in the dorm bathroom, staring absent-mindedly at my reflection. And then I noticed it. My reflection blinked. I didn't. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down my spine. I raised my hand and the reflection mirrored the movement, but there was a split-second lag, like it had to think about what it was doing. Show me what you see, let me in to be free. The words echoed in my head, unbidden, and I stumbled back from the sink. My reflection didn't move at first. It just stood there, staring at me with that faint, eerie smile. Then it followed, stepping back in perfect synchronization. By the end of the week, it was just me. Max stopped coming to class. I saw him in the hallway once, and he looked wrong. His movements were jerky, mechanical, like a puppet on strings. His face was blank, and when he passed a window, his reflection didn't move at all. Kara vanished the next night. I found her scarf draped over the mirror in her dorm, but she was gone. Now it's happening to me. I avoid mirrors, but it doesn't matter. I see it in every reflective surface, windows, puddles, even the polished surface of a spoon. My reflection is always watching, its smile growing wider each day. Last night, I dreamed I was standing in front of the mirror again, chanting the rhyme. My reflection grinned, reaching out, and I woke up screaming. I'm writing this to warn you. If you're reading this, don't play the mirror game. Don't even think about it. I don't know what's on the other side of the glass, but it's not us. It's waiting. And now it's coming for me. The final thing I see before the glass pulls me in is my reflection's smile, wide and gleaming, as it steps out to take my place. And then, darkness. The end. And that's the end. But the night is far from over. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. Tell me, are you still awake? Or did the whispers follow you into your dreams? If sleep won't come just yet, there are plenty more stories waiting for you. Go on, pick another. I'll be here.